Hey everyone, welcome to Nightmare Scene. Before we begin, I'd love to know, which city are you listening from as you hear these spine-chilling stories? Leave a comment to let me know. Alright, now take a deep breath. Let's begin. Living in an old apartment building has its quirks: creaky floors, unreliable plumbing, and a temperamental elevator. The elevator in particular had always unnerved me. It was small, dimly lit, and had a habit of stopping between floors for no apparent reason. But nothing about it had truly scared me until that night. I had stayed late at work, finishing a project that couldn't wait until the next day. By the time I got home, it was almost midnight. The lobby was empty, the building silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I pressed the button for the elevator and waited. The doors opened with a soft chime, revealing the dim interior. I stepped inside, pressing the button for the 7th floor, where my apartment was located. The doors slid shut, and the elevator began its slow, rattling ascent. Around the 3rd floor, the elevator jolted slightly as it always did, and then it stopped. This wasn't unusual. The elevator often stalled for a few seconds before continuing. I leaned against the wall, staring at the glowing numbers above the door, waiting for it to move again. That's when I heard it. A faint tap, 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 like someone gently knocking on glass. It took me a moment to realize the sound was coming from the small, scratched mirror on the back wall of the elevator. My stomach twisted as I turned to look. At first, all I saw was my own reflection, dimly lit and slightly distorted by the old mirror. But then I noticed something else. There was a figure behind me. I whipped around, but the elevator was empty. The doors were still closed, the cramped space silent except for the pounding of my heart. Slowly I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its face was wrong. The features were blurred like a smudged painting, but its eyes were unmistakable, dark, sunken pits that seemed to stare straight through me. The figure stood perfectly still, its head slightly tilted as if observing me. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the elevator doors. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? A reflection from outside? But there was nothing in the elevator except me. Then the figure moved. Its head tilted further, almost unnaturally, and its hand slowly rose to tap the glass again. The sound was louder this time, more deliberate. Asterisk tap. Tap. Tap asterisk. I reached for the elevator buttons, frantically pressing anything that might make the doors open. The elevator jolted again and the lights flickered. When they came back on, the mirror was empty. My reflection was the only thing staring back at me. I barely had time to catch my breath before the elevator started moving again, this time faster than usual. The numbers on the panel blinked rapidly, skipping floors. 3rd, 5th, 7th, and then it stopped at 9. The doors slid open with a groan, revealing a pitch-black hallway. The 9th floor had been vacant for years, the apartments empty and locked. The air that seeped into the elevator was cold, carrying the faint scent of dampness and decay. I reached out to press the closed door button, but before I could, the elevator jolted violently, as if something had struck it from the outside. The lights flickered again, plunging the small space into darkness for a few seconds. When they came back on, my reflection wasn't alone. The figure was back, standing directly behind me. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle now, and its hand was pressed against the glass, the fingers long and spindly. Its face was closer, almost touching mine through the mirror, the dark pits of its eyes staring into mine. I screamed, slamming my hand against every button on the panel. The elevator shuddered and began descending, the hum of the machinery growing louder, almost deafening. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. When the doors finally opened on the ground floor, I stumbled out, nearly collapsing onto the tiled floor of the lobby. The elevator doors closed behind me, and for a moment, everything was silent. I turned to look at the elevator, half expecting it to be empty. But through the small glass window in the door, I saw it. The figure was still there, standing in the center of the elevator, staring at me. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. I spent the rest of the night at a friend's house, too afraid to go back. The next day, I called the building manager and demanded they check the elevator. They found nothing unusual, no malfunction, no strange activity on the security cameras. But when I asked about the 9th floor, the manager hesitated. It's been sealed off for years, he said, but people have reported things, noises, shadows. You're not the first. I moved out of that building a week later. To this day, I avoid elevators whenever I can. But sometimes when I'm alone and the world is quiet, I'll hear it again, that faint tap, tap, tap. And I wonder if it's still waiting for me inside another elevator behind another mirror. My boyfriend Ryan and I had been planning our weekend camping trip for weeks. We were both avid hikers and loved the idea of escaping the city for a couple of days, just the two of us surrounded by nature. We chose a remote campsite deep in the forest, accessible only by a narrow dirt road and a short hike. It was perfect, quiet, secluded, and far from any signs of civilization. We arrived late in the afternoon, set up our tent near a small clearing, and spent the evening enjoying the peace and quiet. By the time night fell, the forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoots of owls, and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. It felt cozy and natural, and we both fell asleep quickly. When I woke up the next morning, the air was crisp, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden beams. Ryan was still asleep, snoring softly in his sleeping bag. I decided to step out and stretch my legs before starting breakfast. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They were all around the tent, a mix of faint and deep impressions in the soft dirt. At first, I thought they were Ryan's, maybe from the night before. But as I crouched down to examine them, I realized something strange. They weren't ours. The footprints were larger than either of our feet and barefoot. The toes were long, the impressions unusually deep, as if whoever had made them had been standing very still for a long time. What was even stranger was how the prints were arranged. They formed a loose circle around the tent, as though someone, or something, had been pacing around us in the middle of the night. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced around the clearing, scanning the forest for any signs of movement. The trees stood still, their shadows stretching lazily across the ground. Everything was quiet, too quiet. I shook Ryan awake, my voice trembling as I told him what I'd found. He frowned, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and stepped outside to take a look. Maybe it was an animal, he suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. An animal doesn't make footprints like these, I replied, pointing to the distinct toes and the deliberate pattern. Ryan didn't have an answer. He gave me a reassuring smile and suggested we pack up and head out for a hike to clear our heads. Reluctantly, I agreed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We spent most of the day exploring the nearby trails, trying to enjoy the natural beauty and forget about the strange footprints. By the time we returned to camp in the late afternoon, I felt a little better. Ryan built a fire and we cooked dinner, the warmth and light helping to push away the lingering unease. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest grew darker, the feeling crept back. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig made my heart race. Ryan tried to calm me down, but I could tell he was on edge too. When it was time to sleep, I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the fabric of the tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. The usual night noises were there, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, but underneath it all, I thought I could hear something else. A faint, rhythmic crunching. Footsteps. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps were slow and deliberate, circling the tent just like before. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out to shake Ryan awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, his eyes wide in the dim light of the tent. We both sat up, listening intently. The footsteps continued for a few more moments before stopping abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. "Stay here," Ryan said, his voice barely audible. He grabbed the flashlight from his bag and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the night. "Ryan, wait," I hissed, but he was already outside. I stayed frozen in place, my ears straining for any sound. I heard him moving around, his footsteps crunching on the dirt as he scanned the clearing with the flashlight. Then, suddenly he called out, "What the hell?" Before I could ask what he saw, he dove back into the tent, zipping it shut behind him. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "There's more footprints," he said, barely above a whisper. "But they just stop. Like whoever it was vanished into thin air." My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to say. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, the flashlight clutched tightly in Ryan's hand. Neither of us slept. When dawn finally broke, we wasted no time packing up. The forest felt oppressive, the trees casting long, menacing shadows across the ground. As we loaded our gear into the car, I couldn't help but glance back at the clearing one last time. That's when I saw it. In the soft dirt where our tent had been, the footprints had returned. This time they didn't form a circle. They led straight to the edge of the clearing, stopping just a few feet from where I stood. I didn't wait to see if anything was watching us from the trees. We drove away as fast as we could, the quiet of the forest replaced by the comforting hum of the highway. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night. But every time I go camping, I find myself checking the ground around my tent, praying I don't see those footprints again. Working as a night security guard at an old warehouse was usually uneventful. Most shifts consisted of staring at the dim glow of surveillance monitors, watching empty hallways and storage rooms bathed in flickering fluorescent light. The warehouse was vast, its rows of metal shelves stretching endlessly in every direction. At night, it became a labyrinth of silence and shadows. That particular night started like any other. The first half of the shift passed quietly. The other guard, Mark, was on patrol somewhere in the building, while I remained in the small security room, nursing a cup of stale coffee. The monitors showed the usual scenes: still shelves, the occasional rat darting across the floor, and the faint swaying of chains hanging from the ceiling in the loading bay. Around 2:30 a.m., something unusual caught my eye on one of the screens. In the back storage hallway, a figure stood at the far end, barely visible in the grainy black and white footage. The figure was motionless, slightly hunched, with its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of it. No one was supposed to be in the building except for Mark and me. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a shadow or a trick of the light. But as I watched, the figure didn't waver or shift. It simply stood there, unnervingly still. Mark was patrolling the east side of the building, nowhere near the back storage area. I had seen him leave on the cameras earlier, his flashlight bobbing as he moved through the dim corridors. There was no way this was him. Moments later, Mark's flashlight appeared on the screen, his figure stepping into the hallway. He walked toward the spot where the strange figure had been standing, sweeping the light back and forth. But when he reached the end of the hallway, there was nothing there. The figure was gone. I replayed the footage, my heart pounding. The timestamp showed the figure entering the hallway moments before Mark arrived. But instead of walking away or disappearing into one of the side doors, the figure simply vanished. Mark returned to his patrol, none the wiser, but I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure. For the next hour, I kept my eyes glued to the monitors, the silence in the security room pressing down on me like a weight. At 3:45 a.m., the figure appeared again. This time it was in the central hallway, much closer to the security room. It stood directly under the camera, its face turned upward as if staring directly into the lens. The distorted feed made it hard to see details, but its head seemed impossibly tilted, and its limbs appeared unnaturally long. A cold dread washed over me as I stared at the screen. My instincts screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there staring. I switched to the adjacent cameras, hoping to see where it had come from, but the other feeds showed nothing. No sign of movement. When I switched back to the central hallway, the figure was gone. Panicking, I rewound the footage, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. As the figure turned to leave, something on the screen made my stomach churn. Its reflection in the polished concrete floor didn't match its movements. While the figure walked away, its reflection stayed rooted in place, staring directly into the camera. I froze, my hands trembling as I paused the footage. My mind raced with questions, but I had no answers. The rest of the shift passed in tense silence. I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see the figure standing in the doorway behind me. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the monitors, sent a jolt of fear through my chest. When dawn finally came, I reviewed the footage again with a clearer head. But this time the figure was gone. The recordings from earlier in the night showed nothing but empty hallways. No shadows. No movements. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next day, hoping for some sort of explanation. He dismissed it as a glitch, saying the old cameras were prone to malfunctions. But when I described the figure, his expression faltered. He admitted that other guards had reported strange sightings in the warehouse at night. Shadows that didn't belong, footsteps echoing in empty hallways, doors that opened and closed on their own. That was my last shift at the warehouse. I couldn't bring myself to return, not after what I'd seen. Even now, I avoid looking at security cameras whenever I can. Because sometimes it's not about what the cameras show, it's about what they don't. Running at night had always been my way of unwinding after a long day. The quiet streets, the cool air, the rhythmic sound of my sneakers hitting the pavement, it was calming. That night was no different. Or at least it didn't start that way. It was close to midnight when I laced up my running shoes and stepped outside. The neighborhood was silent, the occasional street lamp casting pools of dim light on the deserted sidewalks. I adjusted my headphones, letting the steady beat of my playlist drown out the world around me, and started jogging down my usual route. The first mile was uneventful. The streets were empty as they always were at this hour. The only sounds were the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant hum of a car engine. I turned onto a long, straight road lined with houses, their windows dark. That's when I noticed them. Ahead of me, about 50 yards away, was another runner. They were wearing a gray hoodie, the hood pulled up, their movements steady and deliberate. I'd never seen anyone else running this late before, but I brushed it off. Maybe they had the same idea as me, a late-night run to clear their head. I kept my pace steady, the distance between us remaining the same. At first, I found it comforting, even motivating, to see someone else on the road. But as I continued, something started to feel off. The runner never slowed down, never turned their head, never glanced back. Their pace was unnervingly consistent, their strides mechanical, almost too perfect. I thought about passing them, but something held me back. It wasn't fear exactly, but a gnawing unease I couldn't explain. Instead, I slowed my pace, letting the distance between us grow. That's when they stopped. The suddenness of it caught me off guard. One moment they were running smoothly, the next they were standing perfectly still, their back to me. I stopped too, pulling out my headphones. The silence of the night rushed in, heavy and oppressive. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The runner just stood there, their heads slightly tilted, as if listening for something. A chill ran down my spine. Then, without warning, they started running again. But this time they were running toward me. My instincts kicked in before I had time to think. I turned and bolted, my feet pounding against the pavement. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps unnervingly even, closing the distance between us. I veered onto a side street, hoping to lose them in the maze of the neighborhood. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. Every time I glanced back, they were there, just a shadowy figure under the streetlights, their movements unrelenting. As I turned another corner, I spotted an alleyway between two houses and darted into it, pressing myself against the wall. My chest heaved as I tried to control my breathing, straining to listen for their footsteps. Nothing. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Slowly I peered around the edge of the alley. The street was empty. The runner was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I turned back toward the alley, I froze. They were there, standing at the other end, their hooded figure barely visible in the shadows. I didn't wait to see what they would do. I sprinted out of the alley and down the street, my vision blurring with panic. My house was only a few blocks away, and I ran toward it like my life depended on it. When I reached my driveway, I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking. I threw the door open, slammed it shut behind me, and locked it. My chest heaved as I leaned against the door, listening for any sound outside. Minutes passed. Nothing. Cautiously, I moved to the front window and peeked through the curtains. The street was empty. No sign of the runner. I told myself I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I double-checked every lock, closed every curtain, and kept the lights on as I tried to calm down. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep on the couch. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was a text from a neighbor. The message was short, but it made my blood run cold. "Did you see the guy standing outside your house last night? I never ran at night again." It was late, close to midnight, when I finally decided to call it a night. The day had been exhausting, and all I wanted was to sink into bed and let the quiet hum of the suburban night lull me to sleep. My house was on the edge of a small town, surrounded by rows of identical homes, each with its neatly fenced backyard. It was a safe, boring neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing ever happened. That night, as I turned off the living room lights and headed toward the bedroom, something caught my eye. A faint glow was coming from the backyard. I froze, my hand hovering over the light switch. Through the thin curtains covering the back door, I could see a flickering light, faint but unmistakable. For a moment I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe one of the garden lights had malfunctioned, or maybe I had left something plugged in outside. It had to be something simple. Grabbing my phone for its flashlight, I approached the door and peeked through the curtains. The glow was coming from the far end of the yard, near the fence. I couldn't make out what it was, but it didn't seem like a bulb or anything I'd installed. It was moving slightly as though swaying in the wind. I told myself it was probably nothing, a neighbor's light reflecting off something, or maybe even a firefly. But curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The air was cool and the faint scent of damp grass hung in the air. The glow seemed brighter now, casting faint, shifting shadows across the lawn. I took a few cautious steps toward it, the beam of my phone's flashlight cutting through the dark. As I approached, the glow suddenly went out. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The yard was pitch black now, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. I swung the flashlight around, scanning the area. Nothing. The fence was intact, the lawn empty, and the garden tools I'd left out earlier were exactly where I'd left them. I told myself it had to be my imagination. Maybe the light had been a trick of the moonlight or a reflection. Shaking my head, I turned back toward the house. That's when I saw it. The light was back, this time closer. It was hovering just outside the sliding glass door, illuminating the curtains from the inside. My heart leapt into my throat. I hadn't heard anything, no footsteps, no sound of movement. The light was just there, as though it had been waiting for me to turn around. I ran. I don't remember how I got inside or how many locks I threw on the door, but the next thing I knew, I was standing in the living room, clutching my phone with trembling hands. I stared at the back door, half expecting it to burst open. The light was gone again. For the next hour, I sat on the couch, every light in the house blazing. I kept glancing toward the back door, terrified of what I might see. But the yard remained dark and still. Eventually, exhaustion took over. Telling myself it had all been a bad dream or a trick of the light, I went to bed, though I left the hallway light on. I didn't sleep well, every creak of the house jolting me awake. The next morning, I went outside to check the backyard in the safety of daylight. Everything looked normal. The grass was slightly dewy, and there were no signs that anyone, or anything, had been there. I started to convince myself it really had been my imagination. And then I saw the footprints. They were faint, but they were there, bare footprints leading from the far end of the yard to the sliding glass door. The prints stopped abruptly at the door, as though whoever had made them had simply vanished. I moved out of that house a month later. I never found out what caused the light or whose footprints those were. But even now in my new place, I can't sleep without curtains covering every window. Because sometimes in the dead of night, I think I see a faint glow in the corner of my eye. And I don't dare look. I had just moved into a new apartment, a small basement unit in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was affordable, and the landlord, Mr. Carpenter, seemed pleasant enough when I first met him. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with a kind smile and a slightly stooped posture. The apartment had a few quirks, a faint musty smell, uneven floors, but nothing I couldn't live with. The first few nights were uneventful. The apartment was quiet, with only the occasional creak of the pipes or hum of the fridge breaking the silence. I spent my evenings unpacking and settling in, feeling grateful to finally have a place of my own. Then, on my third night, Mr. Carpenter knocked on my door. When I opened it, he stood there, his expression unusually serious. He hesitated for a moment before saying, "Just a heads up. If you hear anything strange coming from the room next door, don't worry about it. That part of the basement isn't used anymore." His words caught me off guard. I hadn't even realized there was another room adjacent to my apartment. I nodded, not sure what else to say, and he gave me a tight smile before walking away. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself thinking about his warning. What kind of noises was he talking about? And why would an unused room make any noise at all? I didn't have to wonder for long. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the wall behind my bed, the one that bordered the mysterious unused room. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the old building settling or the pipes acting up. But the tapping didn't stop. It was steady, deliberate, almost like someone knocking lightly on the wall. I sat up, my heart beginning to race. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stayed frozen in place, straining to hear any other sounds, but the apartment was quiet again. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The next morning, I decided to ask Mr. Carpenter about the room. When I brought it up, he seemed evasive, brushing off my questions with vague answers. "It's just storage," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Old furniture and junk. Nothing to worry about." But I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't telling me the whole truth. That night, the tapping returned. This time it was louder, more erratic. It wasn't just tapping anymore. There were scratching sounds like nails dragging across wood. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to make sense of it, and for a moment I thought I heard something else. A faint, muffled voice. It was impossible to make out the words, but it sounded like someone was whispering on the other side of the wall. My blood ran cold. I grabbed a flashlight and went into the hallway, determined to check the door to the unused room. It was locked, of course, and the doorknob felt ice cold under my hand. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to call Mr. Carpenter, but something about the situation made me hesitate. If he had been hiding something, would he even tell me the truth? The noises continued on and off for the next few nights. I barely slept, constantly on edge, waiting for the next sound to break the silence. I started to notice other strange things too. like the way the hallway light near the door to the unused room would flicker whenever I walked past, or the faint, musty smell that seemed to grow stronger each day. One night, after another round of tapping and scratching, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was behind that door. I waited until morning when I knew Mr. Carpenter would be out, and grabbed a screwdriver from my toolbox. My hands trembled as I worked the screws out of the door hinges, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. Finally, I eased the door open. The room was dark, the air inside heavy and stale. My flashlight illuminated a small, cluttered space filled with old furniture, boxes, and what looked like a broken lamp. At first, it seemed harmless, just a forgotten storage area like Mr. Carpenter had said. But then I saw the chair. It was an old wooden chair placed squarely in the center of the room. The floor around it was covered in deep scratches, as though it had been dragged back and forth repeatedly. On the chair was a single item, a pair of headphones connected to an ancient-looking tape recorder. The tape inside had been rewound, ready to play. Against my better judgment, I pressed the play button. The tape hissed, and then a voice crackled to life. It was faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. "Help me," it whispered. "I'm still here." The tape clicked off. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My heart raced as I scanned the room, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows. But the room was empty, silent except for my own ragged breathing. I left the apartment that same day, abandoning my deposit and leaving most of my belongings behind. I didn't care. Whatever was in that room, whatever Mr. Carpenter was hiding, I wanted no part of it. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that voice on the tape. And I wonder if anyone else is living in that apartment now, if they hear the tapping, the scratching, the whispers, and if they'll be brave or foolish enough to open that door. Exploring the abandoned high school was supposed to be just another harmless adventure. The place had been shut down decades ago after a fire destroyed part of the building. Its charred ruins had become a local legend, rumored to be haunted. For my friends and me, it was simply a challenge, something to do on a boring weekend. We arrived just after sunset, climbing through a shattered window to enter the building. Inside, the air was thick with dampness and the faint smell of soot, a lingering memory of the fire that had closed its doors forever. The hallways stretched into darkness, littered with broken desks, graffiti-covered walls, and fallen ceiling tiles. It was eerily quiet, save for the faint crunch of debris under our footsteps. At first, the exploration was thrilling. We wandered the halls, peering into classrooms filled with overturned chairs and dust-covered chalkboards. Flashlights danced across the wreckage, revealing fragments of a school left behind, faded posters, broken lockers, and forgotten textbooks. It all felt harmless, just another decaying building swallowed by time. But deeper into the school, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, and with it came a faint smell of smoke, subtle but unmistakable. It clung to the walls and filled our lungs with each breath. Then came the sound. A faint static crackled to life, breaking the silence. It was barely audible at first, blending with the rustling of the wind through shattered windows. It took a moment to realize the source of the sound, an old speaker mounted high on the wall. The system, long abandoned and coated in grime, should have been silent. But now, it hissed and crackled, filling the hallway with its distorted noise. The static gave way to a voice, faint and garbled, yet unmistakably human. It spoke in broken, clipped phrases, issuing an instruction that felt wrong in the emptiness of the school. The words carried an eerie weight, their meaning sinking into the group like an unspoken warning. Further down the corridor, a faint light flickered. It was coming from one of the classrooms, its frosted glass door glowing softly. No one could explain how or why the room was lit. There had been no signs of power anywhere else in the building. The closer we got to the classroom, the stronger the smell of smoke became, thick and acrid, stinging our throats. Flashlights revealed nothing unusual beyond the door, just a mess of toppled desks and a cracked blackboard. But in the corner of the room stood an old television, its screen alive with static. The television buzzed faintly, the screen flickering. Then words began to appear across the static, their letters forming and dissolving in quick succession. The message was chillingly simple: stay. Class is about to begin. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The sound of a distant bell echoed through the hallways, warped and wrong, as though it were ringing from another time. It reverberated off the walls, growing louder and more distorted with each chime. Panic set in. The group turned back toward the hallway, stumbling over debris in their haste. The faint static from the speaker followed them, now laced with fragments of whispers, too low to understand but filled with a palpable urgency. The smell of smoke thickened as though a fire were roaring to life just beyond sight. The exit felt impossibly far. The maze of hallways twisted and stretched, every corner revealing more wreckage and empty rooms. Flashlights flickered as if struggling against the oppressive darkness. In the chaos, one of us glanced back, and that was when the shadows began to move. At first, they were just shapes at the edge of the flashlight beams, tall, still figures standing in the periphery. But with each turn, they seemed closer, their outlines sharper. They did not move like people, they did not walk or run. They simply appeared, stepping into existence as though they had always been there, waiting. By the time we reached the window we'd climbed through, the smell of smoke was overwhelming. The hallway behind us was bathed in flickering light, as though the flames that had consumed the school had returned. The oppressive heat chased us as we scrambled outside, collapsing onto the cold grass in the safety of the night. The building loomed silently against the starless sky. The windows, which moments ago had glowed with an unnatural light, were now dark. But the air still carried the faintest trace of smoke, a reminder of what we had left behind. In the following days, curiosity led me to research the school's history. I learned that the fire had started during school hours, trapping students and teachers inside. Some survivors claimed they heard the intercom instructing them to stay in their classrooms, even as smoke filled the halls. The voice from the speaker that night still echoes in my mind. Sometimes, when the world is quiet, I can almost hear it again. The faint crackle of static and those chilling words, "Class is about to begin." It was a rainy Saturday evening, and the shopping mall was unusually quiet. I had gone there to pick up a few things after work, hoping to avoid the weekend crowds. Most of the stores were already closing, their gates halfway down, the lights inside dimmed. The air carried the faint scent of cleaning chemicals, mingling with the metallic tang of rainwater tracked in by the last stragglers. As I wandered through the empty corridors, my footsteps echoed in the silence. It felt oddly peaceful, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a blanket. But as I approached the escalators leading to the ground floor, I noticed something unusual. A child was standing at the base of the escalator. At first, I didn't think much of it. The boy looked to be around 7 or 8, dressed in a bright yellow raincoat with the hood pulled up. He was standing perfectly still, his head slightly tilted downward as though staring at the floor. No one else was nearby, no parents, no shoppers. Just him. I glanced around, expecting to see someone looking for him, but the mall was deserted. Something about his stillness made me hesitate. He didn't seem lost or upset, just eerily calm, like he was waiting for something. As I descended the escalator, I kept my eyes on him. He didn't move. When I reached the bottom, I approached cautiously, unsure of what to do. "Are you okay?" I wanted to ask, but the words caught in my throat. Something about the boy felt wrong. His posture was unnatural, stiff and rigid. The hood of his raincoat cast a shadow over his face, obscuring it in the dim light. For a moment, I thought I saw him twitch, a subtle, almost imperceptible jerk of his shoulders, but when I blinked, he was still again. I debated whether to get security or check on him myself. Before I could decide, he turned and walked away, his steps slow and deliberate, the sound of his wet shoes squeaking faintly on the tiles. I watched as he disappeared around a corner, his small figure swallowed by the shadows. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavier than before. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly made my way to the exit, telling myself it wasn't my problem. But as I approached the glass doors leading to the parking lot, I stopped cold. The boy was outside, standing in the middle of the empty lot, directly under a flickering streetlight. His head was tilted back now, as though he was staring at the sky. The rain fell around him in soft, misty sheets, but he didn't move. He didn't even seem wet. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I hadn't seen him leave the building, and there was no way he could have gotten outside so quickly. The thought crossed my mind that maybe it wasn't the same boy. Maybe I was imagining things. I stepped closer to the glass, trying to get a better look. The streetlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, the boy's face was visible. There was nothing there. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless surface where his face should have been. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. When I looked again, the boy was gone. The parking lot was empty, the streetlights swaying gently in the breeze. I rushed to my car, locking the doors the moment I got inside. My hands trembled as I started the engine and backed out of the lot. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the image of that faceless figure standing in the rain. When I got home, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light or my mind playing games after a long day. But deep down, I knew better. A week later, out of morbid curiosity, I looked up the history of the mall. I found an old article about a missing child, a boy who had vanished from the very same shopping center over a decade ago. Witnesses had last seen him wearing a yellow raincoat, standing near the escalators. He was never found. To this day, I avoid that mall. And on rainy nights, I make sure to keep my curtains drawn. Because sometimes, when the rain falls just right, I think I see a small figure standing outside, bathed in the glow of a flickering light. It was a chilly autumn evening, and I was working late from home. My small apartment was silent except for the occasional hum of passing cars outside and the soft clicks of my keyboard. The desk lamp cast a warm glow over my workspace, the rest of the room swallowed by shadows. Around midnight, I decided to take a break. As I leaned back in my chair and stretched, my eyes wandered toward the door to my bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, leaving a thin sliver of darkness visible through the gap. That's when I noticed it. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, moved behind the door. It was quick, just a flicker of motion like someone walking past. My breath caught and I froze, staring at the gap. The room beyond was dark. I hadn't been in there all evening. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe headlights from a passing car casting strange reflections. But no lights flashed through the window, and the shadow had seemed too deliberate, too human. My heart began to race as I got up from my chair. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, my pulse pounding in my ears. I reached out and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking softly in the stillness. The bedroom was empty. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, and the faint glow of the street lights outside barely filtered through the fabric. I stood in the doorway, scanning the room for anything out of place, but everything seemed normal. Trying to shake off the unease, I turned back toward my desk. But as I did, a sound stopped me cold. A soft, deliberate tap came from the bedroom window. The curtains didn't move. There was no wind outside, no branches brushing against the glass. The sound came again, more insistent this time. Asterisk tap, tap star. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but something compelled me to step closer. My hands trembled as I reached for the edge of the curtain, pulling it back just enough to peek outside. The street below was empty, the usual rows of parked cars and dimly lit sidewalks undisturbed. But as my eyes adjusted to the faint glow, I noticed something strange. On the window pane just inches from my face were smudges. Long, thin streaks as though someone, or something, had pressed their fingers against the glass. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. No one could have reached the window. I lived on the third floor. The realization sent a cold wave of dread through me. I backed out of the bedroom, closing the door firmly behind me. The light from my desk lamp felt like the only barrier between me and whatever had left those marks. I tried to focus on work, telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then, just as I started to calm down, I noticed the shadow again. This time it wasn't behind the bedroom door. It was under it. A faint, elongated silhouette stretched out onto the floor of the living room, its edges shifting slightly, as though something was standing just on the other side. I didn't dare move. My breath came shallow and fast as I stared at the shadow, willing it to disappear. But instead it grew. Slowly, deliberately, it stretched further into the room, the edges flickering unnaturally, like smoke caught in a draft. The apartment was silent, but I felt the air grow colder, heavier. I couldn't bring myself to open the door again. Instead, I grabbed my phone and bolted for the front door, leaving the lights on and slamming it shut behind me. I spent the night in my car, parked on the street below, watching the faint glow of my apartment window. Nothing moved. The shadow stayed still. The next day, I called the landlord, asking if anyone had reported strange activity in the building. He seemed confused but mentioned that previous tenants had left abruptly, citing bad vibes in the unit. He dismissed it as paranoia, but I knew better. I moved out a week later. I never found out what was behind that door or what left the streaks on the window. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my new place, I catch myself staring at the shadows under the door frame, waiting for them to move. Driving a taxi at night is an unpredictable job. The streets come alive in strange ways after dark, with passengers ranging from drunk partiers to exhausted night shift workers. I thought I had seen it all, until the night I picked up that passenger. It was just after 1 a.m. The city had quieted down, leaving the streets nearly empty. My shift was almost over, and I was ready to head home when a new request popped up on the app. The pickup location was a residential street on the outskirts of town. It was a bit out of my way, but the fare was good, so I accepted. The street was eerily still when I arrived, lined with dark houses and only a few flickering streetlights. I waited for a minute, checking my mirrors, but I didn't see anyone coming. Just as I was about to cancel the ride, I noticed a figure emerging from the shadows further down the street. It was a woman dressed in a long coat, her hair obscuring her face. She moved slowly, almost reluctantly, as if she didn't really want to get in the car. I rolled down the window to confirm her name, but she just nodded and opened the back door, sliding into the seat without a word. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at the app for the destination. The address was unfamiliar, a location deep in the industrial district, far from any residences or businesses that would be open at this hour. She didn't respond. Her silence was unsettling, but I figured she might just be tired or didn't want to talk. That wasn't unusual. I started driving, keeping my eyes on the road and trying to ignore the growing unease that crept over me. The ride was silent, except for the faint hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of the windshield wipers. I glanced in the rearview mirror every now and then, but the woman kept her head down, her face obscured by her hair. The industrial district was desolate at night, its streets lined with warehouses and abandoned buildings. As I approached the destination, my unease deepened. The address on the app led to a narrow, dead-end street with no lights. I slowed the car, unsure of what to do. There was no sign of activity, just rows of darkened structures and the faint smell of damp concrete. "We're here," I said, my voice breaking the heavy silence. The woman didn't move. I turned to look at her, expecting some kind of response, but she was completely still. Her face was turned away, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, I thought she might have fallen asleep. "Ma'am?" I said louder this time. Still no response. A chill ran down my spine as I reached back to lightly tap her shoulder. Her coat felt cold, unnaturally so, like it had been left outside on a freezing night. Slowly, she turned her head toward me. Her face was pale, too pale, almost gray, and her eyes were sunken, lifeless. Her mouth was slightly open, but no sound came out. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. Before I could say anything, the car's interior lights flickered, and the dashboard glitched, the radio sputtering to life with a burst of static. Then she was gone. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The back seat was empty. The door hadn't opened, and I hadn't heard her leave. She had just vanished. The only sound was the faint crackle of static from the radio, which abruptly cut off, plunging the car into an oppressive silence. I sat there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. I checked the app again, desperate for some kind of explanation. The trip was still active, but the destination had changed. Instead of the dead-end street, it now pointed to a nearby bridge that spanned the river at the edge of town. My instincts screamed at me to end the ride and drive home, but something compelled me to keep going. I couldn't explain it, curiosity, fear, or something else entirely. Against my better judgment, I started the car and followed the new route. The bridge was empty when I arrived, its expanse bathed in the cold glow of the moonlight. The river below was dark and sluggish, its surface barely visible through the mist that clung to the water. I stopped the car in the middle of the bridge, unsure of what to do next. The app still showed the ride as active, the destination marked right where I was. I waited, gripping the steering wheel tightly, my eyes scanning the empty road for any sign of movement. And then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the bridge, her long coat billowing slightly in the breeze. Her back was to me, her figure illuminated faintly by the moonlight. She didn't move, didn't turn to acknowledge my presence. A sense of dread settled over me as I watched her. I didn't know how she had gotten there, but deep down, I knew I wasn't supposed to be here. I wanted to call out, to ask if she was okay, but my voice caught in my throat. As I sat frozen in the car, the app suddenly ended the ride on its own. The screen went black for a moment before displaying a single message: "Thank you for the ride." When I looked up again, she was gone. I didn't wait to see if she would come back. I slammed the car into reverse and sped off the bridge, my hands shaking on the wheel. The empty streets of the industrial district felt like a maze, and it wasn't until I reached the bright lights of the city center that I finally allowed myself to breathe. To this day, I don't know who or what I picked up that night, but I haven't driven in the industrial district since. And whenever I get a late night request, I hesitate, wondering if she'll be waiting for me again. It all started when I bought an old camera at a thrift store. I wasn't a professional photographer, just someone who enjoyed capturing moments, especially on film. The camera was a vintage 35mm model, its body scratched and worn but still functional. The clerk at the store told me it had been donated by someone clearing out their late grandfather's belongings. I thought it was a great find, a piece of history for just a few bucks. I loaded it with fresh film that evening and decided to test it by taking photos around my apartment. My bookshelf, the view from the window, a cup of tea on the table, mundane snapshots to see how the camera handled light and focus. Satisfied, I set the camera down and made a mental note to drop the film off for development later in the week. 2 days later, I picked up the developed photos from the lab. Flipping through the prints, I was pleasantly surprised by the quality. The colors were warm and the images had a soft, nostalgic feel. But as I reached the last few photos, something caught my eye. In one of the shots of my living room, a simple photo of the couch and coffee table, there was a shadow in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was mine, but the angle didn't make sense. The shadow was tall, elongated, and seemed to stretch unnaturally toward the center of the room. I stared at the photo, trying to recall if anything could have caused it. Maybe a trick of the light or something outside casting a reflection. But the longer I looked, the more uneasy I felt. The shadow didn't belong there. The next evening, curiosity got the better of me and I decided to take more photos. This time, I tried to replicate the angle of the living room shot, hoping to figure out what had caused the shadow. I snapped a few frames, then moved to other parts of the apartment, taking pictures of the kitchen, the hallway, and even the bedroom. When I developed the second roll of film, my stomach dropped. The shadow was in every photo. It wasn't always in the same place. In some shots, it lingered in the corner of the room, barely visible. In others, it loomed closer, darker, more defined. In a picture of my hallway, it stretched across the wall like it was reaching for something. In one of the bedroom photos, it was at the foot of the bed. I couldn't explain it. My apartment was brightly lit when I took those photos, and I had been alone. There was no logical reason for the shadow to appear, and certainly not in different places across multiple images. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside made my heart race. I kept the lights on, the camera sitting on the table where I could see it. I thought about throwing it away, but something stopped me. I needed to understand what was happening. The next morning, I decided to test the camera outside. I walked to a nearby park, snapping photos of trees, benches, and open spaces. I avoided taking pictures of people, not wanting to accidentally involve anyone else. When the film was developed, I held my breath as I flipped through the prints. The shadow was there. In a photo of an empty bench, it stood just behind it, faint but unmistakable. In a shot of a tree, it seemed to blend with the trunk, its elongated form bending unnaturally. In one of the final images, it was closer than ever, as if it had moved toward the lens. I stopped using the camera after that. I locked it in a drawer, unwilling to throw it away but too terrified to pick it up again. For weeks, I avoided looking at the photos, shoving them into a box and hiding them in the back of my closet. But the shadow didn't stay in the photos. One night, as I was lying in bed, I felt it. A heavy, oppressive presence in the room. The air grew colder and I could hear a faint rustling like fabric brushing against the walls. My chest tightened as I forced myself to look toward the corner of the room. The shadow was there. It was darker than the surrounding darkness, an absence of light that seemed to pulse and shift. It didn't move like a person would. Instead, it stretched and bent, its edges flickering like smoke caught in a draft. I froze, too terrified to breathe. For what felt like an eternity, the shadow lingered, its presence pressing down on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The air felt lighter and the room was silent again. The next morning, I grabbed the camera, the photos, and everything else connected to it and drove to the edge of town. I found an empty lot and buried the camera as deep as I could, covering it with dirt and stones. I thought that would be the end of it. But now, weeks later, I still see it. Sometimes, when the light is just right, I catch a glimpse of a shadow that shouldn't be there, on the walls, in reflections just at the edge of my vision. It's always watching, waiting. I don't know if it's the same shadow or if it's something else entirely, but I can't shake the feeling that no matter where I go, it will find me again. I've always thought of myself as someone who can handle driving alone at night. But after what happened a few months ago, I'm not so sure anymore. That night, I was driving back home after visiting a friend who lived about 3 hours away. It was late, close to midnight, and the highway was eerily empty. Just the occasional truck rumbling past in the opposite lane. After 2 hours on the road, my gas gauge was dangerously low, and I knew I couldn't risk skipping the next gas station. The thought of being stranded alone in the middle of nowhere was worse than the creepy vibe of stopping at an isolated station. Eventually, I spotted one in the distance, a faint glow in the darkness. It was an old, run-down place with a single pump and a convenience store that looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades. The fluorescent light above the pump flickered erratically, and there wasn't a single other car or person in sight. I pulled up to the pump, turned off my engine, and stepped out. The quiet was unsettling, no sounds of insects, no distant hum of traffic. Just the soft buzz of the fluorescent light. As I began filling up my tank, I thought I heard something, a faint clatter like metal hitting concrete. It came from somewhere near the convenience store. I froze, gripping the nozzle tightly, and scanned the area. The glass door of the shop was closed, and the dim lights inside cast long, distorted shadows. But I didn't see anyone. Telling myself it was probably just a falling shelf or something, I went back to pumping gas. Then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My skin prickled and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. Slowly, I turned my head toward the shop. Through the glass door, I saw movement. A dark figure, partially obscured by the shelves inside, was standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching me. My heart started racing. I told myself not to panic. Maybe it was the store clerk, although I hadn't noticed anyone when I pulled in. Still, there was something about the way they stood, motionless and half-hidden, that made my stomach churn. I replaced the nozzle as quickly as I could and got back into my car, locking the doors immediately. I glanced back toward the shop before starting the engine, and the figure was gone. The glass door now stood slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. That's when I noticed something even more chilling. A second car parked on the far side of the lot. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I didn't wait to think. I started the car and pulled out of the station, keeping my eyes on the road ahead. The highway was as empty as before, and for a moment, I thought I was in the clear. But then in my rearview mirror, I saw headlights. The car was following me. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone who needed gas too, or maybe they were heading in the same direction. But as I drove on, it became clear that wasn't the case. The car stayed just far enough behind me to avoid suspicion, but every time I changed lanes or adjusted my speed, they did the same. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached. I decided to test them. I took the next exit, a desolate ramp leading to a smaller country road. The car followed. I sped up, my heart pounding in my chest. The headlights grew closer. Suddenly, the car behind me swerved into the left lane and sped up, pulling alongside me. I caught a glimpse of the driver's window. It was too dark to see their face, but they were there, staring at me. My chest tightened with fear as their car swerved closer, as if trying to force me off the road. I floored the accelerator, my little car struggling to pick up speed. The other car stayed beside me for a few more moments, then dropped back behind me, their headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. Ahead, I saw the faint glow of another gas station, this one larger with several cars and trucks parked under its lights. I veered into the lot, my tires screeching as I came to a stop. The following car slowed as it passed the station but didn't pull in. It drove past and disappeared down the highway. I sat there in the car, shaking and gasping for breath. After a few minutes, I managed to calm down enough to call the police. The dispatcher told me to stay where I was until an officer arrived. When they did, I told them everything: the gas station, the figure in the shop, the car that had followed me and tried to run me off the road. The officer nodded grimly and took my statement. He said they'd investigate, but there wasn't much to go on without a license plate or clearer details. The thought of that car still being out there, its driver hunting for their next victim, sent chills down my spine. I never found out who, or what, was watching me at the gas station that night, and I don't think I ever want to. Now, I make sure to fill up my tank well before sunset, no matter how inconvenient it might be. Some risks just aren't worth taking. I had been living alone for about a year when this happened. My apartment was in a quiet neighborhood, nothing fancy, but it was safe and affordable. The kind of place where neighbors nodded at each other in passing but didn't really talk. Across from my building was another small apartment complex. At night, their windows would light up one by one as people settled in, each window a little glimpse into someone else's life. One window in particular always caught my eye. It was directly across from my living room, and its curtains were always drawn. The light behind them was dim, but it was always on, even late at night. I never saw anyone in the window or going in and out of the unit. I figured maybe it was someone who worked odd hours or simply valued their privacy. One evening, after a long day at work, I was sitting on my couch, scrolling mindlessly through my phone. It was late, close to midnight, and the street outside was silent except for the occasional car passing by. I glanced up from my phone and saw that window again. The curtains were still closed, but this time, something was different. There was a small gap between the curtains. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but it was enough to catch my attention. Through the gap, I could see the faint outline of someone standing there. They were perfectly still, just standing behind the curtains looking out. Or more accurately, looking at me. I froze. My first thought was that I was imagining it. Maybe it was a shadow or a trick of the light. I squinted, leaning closer to my own window to get a better look. No, it wasn't a shadow. It was definitely a person, partially obscured by the curtains, but I could see their head and shoulders. They weren't moving. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, just a neighbor maybe watching the street or lost in thought. But something about the stillness of their posture made me uneasy. After a minute, I decided to ignore it. I pulled the curtains in my own apartment closed and went to bed. The next night, the gap in the curtains was still there, and the figure was still standing in the same spot. This time, I couldn't pretend it wasn't strange. It was late again, well past the time most people would be awake, and the figure hadn't moved. They were in the exact same position, just standing and staring. I felt like their gaze was fixed directly on my apartment, even though I couldn't see their face. I tried to focus on the TV, pretending I didn't notice. But every few minutes, my eyes would dart back to the window, checking to see if they had moved. They hadn't. I told myself not to overthink it, that it was just someone being weird. People are strange sometimes, right? But deep down, I felt uneasy in a way I couldn't shake. On the third night, I decided to test something. I turned off all the lights in my apartment, leaving only the faint glow of the TV. Then I slowly approached my window, keeping low so I wouldn't be visible. I peeked out from the edge of the curtain, trying to see if the figure was still there. They were. And this time, the gap in the curtain seemed wider. I could see more of the room behind them now. Dim light, plain walls, a few pieces of furniture. But the figure hadn't moved. They were still staring straight ahead, their body unnervingly still. My stomach twisted as I realized something else. The figure wasn't standing close to the window. They were further back in the room, but they were tall. Too tall. Their head nearly reached the top of the window frame, which didn't make sense. I had seen the building up close. It was an older complex with fairly low ceilings. Whoever or whatever this was, they weren't normal. I pulled back from the window, my heart pounding. My first instinct was to call the police, but what could I say? That my neighbor's curtains were slightly open, and I thought the person behind them looked weird? I'd sound ridiculous. Instead, I decided to try and ignore it. I kept my curtains closed at all times, even during the day. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, I couldn't stop thinking about that figure and the way they seemed to watch my apartment. A few nights later, I was jolted awake by a loud thud. It was coming from the direction of the neighbor's building. My heart raced as I got out of bed and cautiously approached my window. Peeking through a tiny gap in my curtains, I looked across the street. The light in the window was off. The gap in the curtains was gone. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe whoever lived there had finally moved out, or maybe I had just imagined the whole thing. But as I stood there, staring at the now dark window, I noticed something else. The street below was empty, except for a set of footprints. They started just below my apartment building and led straight to my door. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called my landlord and asked about the apartment across the street. She sounded confused and told me that the unit had been vacant for months. There was no tenant, no one who could have been standing in that window. To this day, I keep my curtains closed at night no matter where I live. Because sometimes when the lights are off and the world is quiet, I swear I can feel someone watching me. I'd always thought of my car as a safe space. It was my refuge during long commutes, my companion on late-night drives. But after what happened that night, I can't sit behind the wheel without glancing over my shoulder, afraid of what I might see. It started on a quiet Sunday night. I was driving back home after spending the weekend at my parents' house. My 5-year-old son, Noah, was fast asleep in the back seat, his little head leaning against his car seat. The drive was long, almost 2 hours, and the dark highway stretched endlessly before me, illuminated only by the pale glow of my headlights. The night was uneventful at first. The gentle hum of the tires on the asphalt, the occasional whir of passing trucks, it all lulled me into a calm rhythm. Noah hadn't stirred since we left, and I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, reassured by the peaceful rise and fall of his chest. But about halfway through the drive, something changed. I glanced in the rearview mirror again just to check on Noah, and my heart stopped. There was a little girl sitting next to him. Her hair was dark and matted, falling in uneven clumps around her face. She was dressed in a tattered white dress that looked dirty and torn. Her face was turned slightly toward Noah, but she wasn't moving. She wasn't even blinking. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding slightly on the empty road. Noah woke up with a startled cry, and I immediately twisted around in my seat to look at the back seat. There was no one there. "Noah, are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. He looked at me with sleepy confusion and nodded. "What's wrong, Mommy?" I forced a smile, though my hands were trembling as I turned back to the wheel. "Nothing, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." I took a deep breath and convinced myself I'd imagined it. I was tired, driving late at night, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. But no matter how much I rationalized it, I couldn't shake the image of that little girl, her blank expression, and the way she seemed to be watching Noah. I continued driving, trying to focus on the road. I told myself not to look in the mirror again, but the urge was overwhelming. After a few minutes, I gave in and glanced up. She was back. This time, she wasn't looking at Noah. She was looking at me. Her head was tilted slightly, her dark, sunken eyes meeting mine through the mirror. My breath caught in my throat, and my hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I couldn't look away. Her lips moved ever so slightly, as if she was whispering something, but I couldn't hear anything over the pounding of my heart. I forced myself to look back at the road, my pulse racing. "It's not real," I muttered under my breath. "It's not real." But the moment I glanced back in the mirror, she was gone again. I wanted to pull over, to get out of the car and check every inch of it, but the highway was deserted, and the thought of stepping into the pitch-black night terrified me even more than staying inside the car. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror, half expecting her to reappear at any moment. The final stretch of the drive felt like an eternity. Every shadow on the roadside, every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision made my stomach lurch. I didn't dare look in the mirror again. Instead, I focused entirely on the road ahead, praying that I could make it home without incident. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. Noah was still asleep, oblivious to everything that had just happened. I hesitated before looking in the rearview mirror one last time. Empty. I let out a shaky sigh of relief and stepped out of the car. As I unbuckled Noah from his car seat and lifted him into my arms, I couldn't help but glance into the back seat one more time. Nothing. Just the familiar sight of Noah's toys scattered on the seat and the faint smell of his blanket. I carried him inside, locked every door and window, and left all the lights on. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those empty, lifeless eyes staring back at me. The next day, I decided to take my car to a mechanic. I didn't know what I was hoping they'd find, maybe some kind of logical explanation like a reflection or a trick of the light. The mechanic inspected every inch of the car and found nothing unusual. No strange stains, no signs of tampering, nothing. For weeks, I avoided driving at night. I even stopped using my rearview mirror unless it was absolutely necessary. But no matter how much time passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in my car that night. Sometimes when I'm driving, I still feel the urge to glance in the mirror, even though I know I shouldn't. And every now and then, when I give in, I think I catch a glimpse of something, a flash of white, a shadow that shouldn't be there. It's always gone before I can get a good look, but it's enough to remind me of that night. Enough to remind me that she's still there. Living alone has its perks: quiet mornings, total freedom, and no one to argue with over chores. But it also has its downsides. That sense of vulnerability, of knowing that if something goes wrong, you're on your own. I never felt that vulnerability more than on the night I saw the footprints. It was a rainy Thursday night, and I was working late from home. My apartment was on the third floor of an older building in a quiet part of town. The building had a long, dimly lit hallway with old wooden floors that creaked whenever someone walked by. Most of my neighbors were older and rarely made noise, so it was usually peaceful. I was typing away at my laptop when I heard it, the soft creak of a floorboard in the hallway. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just someone heading to their apartment. But the sound didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was walking back and forth outside my door. Curious, I stood up and went to the peephole. The hallway was empty. Just the flickering of the old light bulb at the far end. I shrugged it off, assuming my mind was playing tricks on me, and went back to my desk. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was louder and it seemed closer, like the footsteps were right outside my door. My stomach tightened. I got up again and looked through the peephole. Still nothing. The hallway was as empty as before. I decided to open the door just to put my mind at ease. As I stepped out, the faint smell of damp wood filled my nose. I looked down the hallway in both directions. No one. But then, as I turned to go back inside, I noticed the floor. There were wet footprints leading down the hallway, stopping right in front of my door. I froze, staring at them. They were clear and distinct, shaped like bare feet, with the droplets of water pooling around the edges. My building had carpeted stairwells, so whoever left them must have come from inside, not outside. And yet, I hadn't heard a single door open or close. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped back into my apartment and locked the door, my hands trembling as I turned the deadbolt. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a neighbor playing a prank or some maintenance worker tracking in water. But the uneasy feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. I tried to focus on my work, but every creak of the floorboards in my apartment made me jump. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting to see the knob turn or hear a knock. But nothing happened. An hour later, I decided to check the hallway again. I told myself it was to make sure everything was fine, but deep down, I think I just wanted to convince myself that it had all been in my head. When I opened the door, the footprints were gone. The hallway was dry as if they'd never been there. I stared at the floor, my heart pounding. There was no way they could have dried that quickly. And even if someone had cleaned them up, I would have heard it. The silence in the building was absolute. I closed the door and locked it again, this time sliding a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I wasn't taking any chances. That night I barely slept. Every sound in the apartment felt amplified. The hum of the fridge, the creak of the walls, the rain tapping against the windows. At one point I thought I heard faint breathing, but when I sat up to listen, it stopped. The next morning I decided to talk to the building manager. I described what I'd seen, expecting him to laugh it off or tell me I was overreacting. But instead, his expression grew serious. "You're sure the footprints stopped at your door?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Why?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "It's probably nothing. Maybe a leak or something." He offered a weak smile. "I'll check it out later." His response didn't reassure me. If anything, it made me more uneasy. That night, I went to bed early, hoping to make up for the sleep I'd lost. But around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. A soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the hallway right outside my door. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it the same person who'd left the footprints? Or was it something worse? Summoning every ounce of courage, I got out of bed and crept toward the door. I didn't dare open it this time. Instead, I peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the light bulb at the far end of the hall was flickering, casting strange shadows on the walls. And then I saw them, wet footprints forming slowly on the floor, one after the other, moving toward my door. But there was no one there. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and as soon as the sun rose, I packed a bag and left. I didn't even bother telling the building manager. I moved out of that apartment a week later. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night or where the footprints came from. But every time I walk down a hallway, I can't help but glance at the floor just in case. Because sometimes, the things you don't see are the ones that stay with you the longest. When my husband and I bought our first home, we thought we had hit the jackpot. It was an older house, a bit run down, but full of charm and potential. The price was surprisingly affordable, and we were thrilled to finally have a place of our own. The previous owner had been an elderly man who passed away, and his family was eager to sell. The house needed some work, but we didn't mind rolling up our sleeves. The basement, however, was another story. From the moment we first toured the house, the basement gave me an odd feeling. It was unfinished, with bare concrete floors and wooden beams crisscrossing above. The air down there was damp and cold, even in the summer. There was a faint smell of earth and mildew that never quite went away, no matter how many times we cleaned. My husband shrugged it off as normal for old houses, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I got every time I went down there. The first few weeks in the house were uneventful. We spent our days painting walls, assembling furniture, and making the place feel like home. The basement was mostly used for storage, boxes, tools, and the old water heater the previous owner had left behind. But one night, while I was folding laundry in the basement, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound. At first, I thought it was the wind or the creaking of the house settling, but as I stood there, holding my breath, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the far corner of the basement, where the shadows were the deepest. Sounded like breathing. Slow, shallow breaths, almost as if someone, or something, was trying not to be heard. My heart raced as I stared into the dark corner. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. My husband was upstairs, and I knew no one else should be in the house. The breathing stopped. I stood frozen for a moment, waiting for something to happen. When nothing did, I shook it off, convincing myself it was my imagination. I grabbed the laundry basket and hurried back upstairs, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I didn't tell my husband. I didn't want him to think I was being paranoid. Over the next few nights, the breathing came back. Always faint, always coming from the same corner of the basement. I tried to ignore it, but it got harder each time. One night, as I was heading upstairs, I swear I heard something else. A soft shuffle, like a footstep on concrete. I stopped using the basement altogether after that. If I needed something stored down there, I'd ask my husband to get it. I could tell he thought I was being silly, but he didn't argue. One night, while he was out with friends, I was alone in the house. I tried to keep myself busy, cooking, watching TV, scrolling through my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around midnight, I heard it again. The breathing. It was louder this time, and it didn't stop. It rose and fell steadily, coming from directly below me. My chest tightened as I realized I was sitting in the living room, right above the basement. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and opened the basement door. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice echoing against the concrete walls. The breathing stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears. Then, as I swept the flashlight across the room, I saw it. The far corner of the basement, where the breathing had always come from, had been disturbed. The floor was no longer smooth concrete. It had been dug up, the earth beneath exposed and uneven. My flashlight caught the edge of something metallic buried in the dirt, a pair of old rusted glasses. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. That's when I heard it again. Not breathing this time, but movement. The unmistakable sound of something shifting behind me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam landed on the water heater in the center of the room. Behind it, I caught a glimpse of a shadow, a tall, narrow figure that moved out of sight as soon as the light touched it. I ran. I don't remember how I got upstairs or how many times I locked the basement door behind me. I called my husband, begging him to come home. When he arrived, I was too shaken to explain everything, but I insisted we call the police. The officers who arrived were skeptical but thorough. They searched the basement and found the disturbed dirt and the rusted glasses. They also found something else, deep scratches on the wooden beams near the corner of the room, as if someone, or something, had been clawing at them. They didn't find any signs of an intruder and chalked it up to rodents or old structural issues. But I knew better. We moved out a month later. I couldn't stay in that house another night, not after what I'd seen. The new owners seemed nice enough when we handed over the keys. I didn't warn them about the basement. Sometimes late at night I wonder if they've heard it yet, the breathing. And if they have, whether they've been brave enough to follow it to the corner of the basement. It was a quiet Friday night. I just finished my shift at the hospital, and the only thing on my mind was getting some rest. The apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I'd settled onto the couch, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, when I heard it, a knock at the door. It was almost midnight. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I hadn't ordered anything. My apartment complex wasn't exactly high traffic, and visitors usually needed to be buzzed in. But the knock came again, louder this time. Cautiously, I got up and approached the door, peering through the peephole. At first, all I saw was a distorted view of the dimly lit hallway. Then a figure came into focus, a man in a baseball cap and a dark jacket. He was holding a small package. "Delivery," he called out, his voice muffled through the door. I frowned. I hadn't ordered anything, and I didn't recognize the man. Something about the situation felt off. Why would a delivery be arriving this late? And why hadn't he buzzed the intercom downstairs? "Who's it for?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unease creeping up my spine. The man didn't answer immediately. He shifted slightly, his free hand slipping into his jacket pocket. "Just open the door," he said. His tone was casual, almost friendly, but something about it made my skin crawl. "No thanks," I replied firmly. "You've got the wrong apartment." For a moment there was silence. Then he knocked again, harder this time. "It's just a package," he insisted. "Come on, open up." I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding. Something about the way he spoke, the forced cheerfulness, the slight edge beneath it, set off every alarm bell in my head. I backed further into the apartment, reaching for my phone on the counter. The knocking stopped. For a moment I thought he'd given up. I crept back to the door and looked through the peephole again. The hallway was empty. I exhaled, relief washing over me. Maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe he really had the wrong apartment. I turned away from the door, intending to call it a night, when I heard the sound. The doorknob was rattling. I spun around, my stomach twisting in fear. The man was back, and now he was trying to open the door. The lock held, but the knob shook violently as he twisted and pulled. "Open the door," he shouted, the fake friendliness gone from his voice. He sounded angry now, almost desperate. I stumbled back, clutching my phone and dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The operator answered quickly, and I stammered out my address and what was happening. They assured me that an officer was on the way. The rattling stopped again. This time it was followed by a heavy silence. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, my eyes glued to the door. I thought I heard faint footsteps retreating down the hall, but I couldn't be sure. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. When the police finally arrived, I opened the door cautiously. The hallway was empty. No sign of the man. The officers searched the building but didn't find anyone matching my description. They checked the security cameras in the lobby, but the footage showed nothing unusual. No one had buzzed in and no one had come through the front entrance. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak and groan of the building made me jump. The next morning I found something on my doorstep, a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. My name and address were scrawled on the front in black marker. There was no return address. My hands shook as I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected, and something inside rattled when I moved it. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a single item, a baseball cap identical to the one the man had been wearing. This experience changed how I see the world. I double-check every lock, avoid opening the door for strangers, and always keep my phone within arm's reach. But the thing that haunts me most isn't the man or the cap. It's the footage the police showed me later. There was a man in the hallway that night. He had been standing there for at least 15 minutes before he knocked. But on the footage he never looked at my door. Not once. Instead, he stared straight at the camera, his face hidden under the brim of his hat. And just before he walked away, he smiled. It was almost midnight by the time I clocked out of my shift at the supermarket. The store was eerily quiet at that hour, the kind of silence that made every small sound feel louder than it should. I grabbed my jacket and bag, said a quick goodbye to the security guard, and stepped outside into the cold, empty parking lot. The lot was massive, but only a few cars remained scattered across the dimly lit space. My car was parked toward the back, a habit I had developed to avoid the crowded spots near the entrance during the day. Now, as I walked toward it, I regretted that choice. The orange glow of the flickering overhead lights barely reached that far, and the shadows between the cars seemed to stretch endlessly. I told myself to shake it off. It was just a parking lot, and I was being paranoid. The soles of my sneakers scuffed lightly against the pavement as I made my way across the asphalt. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the faint hum of the nearby highway. And then I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just an echo of my own steps, bouncing off the surrounding cars. But when I stopped walking, the sound continued, a steady, deliberate tap, tap, tap on the pavement. It was coming from behind me. I turned around quickly, scanning the lot. The area was empty. Just rows of silent, shadowy cars under the dim lights. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound had been so clear, so distinct. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no response. Only silence. I forced a laugh, trying to calm myself. "It's just your imagination," I muttered. Turning back toward my car, I walked a little faster now, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. But as soon as I moved, the footsteps started again. This time closer, louder. My heart pounded as I quickened my pace. I didn't dare look back. The sound of the steps matched mine perfectly, as if someone was walking just a few feet behind me. I could feel the weight of their presence, the way the air seemed to grow heavier with every step. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling. The footsteps stopped just as I unlocked the door and slid inside, slamming it shut behind me. For a moment, I sat there in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel and staring out the windshield. The lot was still empty. I let out a shaky breath and started the engine. The headlights flickered on, casting a harsh glow across the pavement in front of me. That's when I saw it. A single shoe. It was lying a few feet away from my car, just barely visible in the beam of my headlights. It was old and scuffed, the laces frayed. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I stared at it, my pulse racing as a creeping dread washed over me. Then something moved. In the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow dart between the parked cars. My breath caught and I whipped my head around, but it was gone. The parking lot was still. Too still. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Slamming the car into reverse, I backed out of the spot and sped toward the exit. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The road back to my apartment was dark and empty. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Every shadow on the roadside looked like it was moving, every distant figure like it was following me. When I finally reached my building, I parked as close to the entrance as I could and rushed inside, locking the door behind me. For a while, I stood in the living room, staring out the window at the empty street below, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the street was silent. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe the footsteps were just echoes, and the shadow was a trick of the light. But the shoe, that was real. The next day, I decided to check the parking lot security cameras. The store manager was kind enough to let me watch the footage, and I felt a mix of anticipation and dread as he fast-forwarded through the recording. There I was, walking across the lot toward my car. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, following me at a distance. They stayed just out of reach of the light, their features impossible to make out. But they were tall, unnaturally thin, and they moved with an odd, jerking gait. The figure stopped when I stopped, and when I turned around to look, they ducked behind a nearby car. My stomach twisted as I watched myself unlock my car and get inside. The figure stood motionless for a moment, watching. Then, just before I drove away, they walked to the spot where my car had been parked and placed the shoe on the ground. The screen froze as the manager hit pause. He turned to me, his face pale. "Did you see anyone else in the lot last night?" he asked. I shook my head, my throat dry. "No, just footsteps." The manager rewound the footage and played it again. This time the screen showed only me walking across the lot. There was no figure, no movement, and no shoe. I left the store that day feeling colder than I ever had in my life. I don't know what I saw in that parking lot, or why the cameras didn't capture it. But I haven't worked a closing shift since. Because now I know. Sometimes what's following you isn't meant to be seen. As someone who works late-night shifts in an office downtown, I've grown used to the stillness of empty hallways and the hum of overhead lights. But that night, the silence wasn't comforting, it felt suffocating. It started like any other evening. The office was deserted by 8 p.m., leaving me alone to wrap up a project with a tight deadline. My desk sat near a large window overlooking the city, the skyline twinkling against the dark sky. The only sounds were the occasional whir of the air conditioning and the soft clicks of my keyboard. Around 10 p.m., I reached for my phone, wanting to check the time. It wasn't on my desk. I distinctly remembered placing it there earlier. Frowning, I searched under papers, in my bag, even in my jacket pocket. Nothing. I didn't panic. It was probably in the break room or at the printer. I'd been moving around the office all evening and must have set it down somewhere. Grabbing a flashlight app on my laptop, I started retracing my steps. The office felt different at night. The open floor plan that buzzed with life during the day now seemed vast and uninviting. Shadows pooled in the corners, and every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Still, I brushed off my unease and headed for the break room. It wasn't there. I checked the printer, the conference room, even the bathroom. No phone. Back at my desk, I tried to think logically. Could it have fallen behind something? I got down on my hands and knees, peering under the desk. As I did, I heard it, a faint buzz. My heart leapt. It was my phone. The sound was faint, coming from somewhere nearby. I stood up and followed the noise, which led me toward the far end of the office, where the storage cabinets were. By the time I reached them, the buzzing stopped. I opened each drawer, rifling through stacks of paper and office supplies, but my phone wasn't there. Frustrated, I decided to use my laptop to locate it. I logged into a tracking app I'd installed months ago, never thinking I'd actually need it. The screen loaded and a small green dot appeared on the map. My phone was inside the office. What was strange, though, was its location. It was showing up right behind me. I turned around quickly, expecting to see it lying on the floor or on a nearby desk, but the space was empty. I stared at the map, confused. The dot wasn't moving. It was stationary, less than 10 feet away. The silence in the office grew heavier. I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. My pulse quickened. Telling myself I was being ridiculous, I refreshed the map. The green dot hadn't budged. Summoning my courage, I stood up and began searching again, combing through every inch of the area behind me. Nothing. No phone, no sound, just the oppressive quiet of the empty office. Then I heard it. A faint ding echoed from the direction of my desk. A notification. My phone was there. Relief flooded through me as I rushed back, convinced I'd somehow overlooked it earlier. But when I reached my desk, it wasn't there. The ding came again, this time from the far end of the office, the same area I just searched. I froze, my hands trembling. Someone was moving it. My breath hitched as I tried to think of what to do. I wasn't entirely sure I was alone anymore. Steeling myself, I grabbed a pair of scissors from my drawer and crept toward the sound. The ding came again, pulling me deeper into the office. When I reached the source, my stomach twisted. Sitting in the center of an empty desk was my phone. I grabbed it quickly, scanning the room, but I saw nothing. My hands shook as I unlocked the screen. The notification that had dinged was a new video. It had been recorded moments ago. My heart pounded as I opened it. The video was shaky, as if whoever had filmed it was moving quickly. The frame was dark, but I could make out faint shapes, the layout of my office. Then the camera panned to a desk. My desk. The video showed me sitting at my computer, completely unaware that I was being filmed. A chill ran down my spine. I turned the phone off and backed away, my eyes darting around the room. Whoever had taken the video was here, watching me. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled toward the exit. As I reached the door, I glanced back one last time. The office was empty, just as it had been all night. But something caught my eye. On the far wall, the large glass window reflected the space behind me. And standing there in the reflection was a shadow. Tall, motionless, and unmistakably human. I didn't turn around. I bolted out of the office, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. The next morning, I reported the incident to building security. They reviewed the cameras but found nothing. No one had entered or exited the office after hours. No movement in the footage except for me. I don't work late nights anymore. I make sure to leave before sunset, no matter how much work I have left. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, was in the office that night is still there, waiting for me to return. It happened on a night I wish I could forget. I was driving home after visiting a friend, my stomach grumbling from skipping dinner. I pulled off the highway at a dimly lit rest stop, hoping to grab a snack and use the restroom before continuing the long drive home. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a couple of trucks parked near the far edge. The building itself was unremarkable, a small convenience store with an attached public restroom. A flickering street light overhead cast uneven shadows across the cracked asphalt. I hesitated for a moment, but the pressing need to relieve myself won out. As I stepped inside, the convenience store was empty. The lone cashier was hunched over his phone behind the counter, barely acknowledging my presence. The restroom was tucked away in the back, its door slightly ajar. The smell hit me first, stale air mixed with the faint scent of cleaning chemicals. The lights inside the restroom buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow over the tiled walls. There were 3 stalls, each with its door slightly ajar. The first 2 were empty, as I quickly confirmed, but the third one was closed. I didn't think much of it at first. Someone else was probably in there. I took the stall closest to the door, trying to finish up quickly and get back on the road. But as I sat there, I started to notice something strange. The third stall was completely silent. There were no sounds of shuffling feet, no rustling of clothes or toilet paper. None of the usual noises you'd expect from an occupied stall. Just silence. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe they were just being quiet, or maybe the stall was out of order, and the door had been left closed. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. As I finished up and stood to leave, I glanced at the floor beneath the stalls. The first two had the usual sight of scuffed tiles and faint reflections of the dim overhead lights. But the third stall's floor was empty. No shoes. No shadows. Nothing. My stomach tightened as I stared at the empty space beneath the door. I was sure it had been closed when I walked in. The gap at the bottom should have revealed someone's feet if it was occupied, but there was nothing there. No sound. No movement. Trying to calm my racing thoughts, I approached the sink to wash my hands. I kept glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see something behind me. But the restroom was as empty as before. The only sound was the dripping of a leaky faucet. I dried my hands quickly, ready to leave, when I heard it. A soft creak, like the sound of a door slowly opening. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I turned toward the stalls. The third stall door was ajar now, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond it. My breath hitched and I took an involuntary step back. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The door creaked again, swinging open another inch. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the widening gap. The space beyond the door was pitch black, darker than it should have been. Felt wrong, like I was staring into a void. And then something moved. It was quick, so quick that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. A flicker of shadow, low to the ground, darting out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled toward the door, nearly slipping on the damp tiles. As I reached for the restroom door handle, I heard a sound that chilled me to the core. A low, raspy breath coming from the direction of the third stall. It was slow and deliberate, like whatever was in there wanted me to know it was watching. I bolted out of the restroom, my footsteps echoing in the empty convenience store. The cashier looked up from his phone, startled by my sudden exit. I didn't stop to explain. I ran to my car, locking the doors the moment I was inside. My hands trembled as I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, the restroom door still visible in my rearview mirror. For a brief second, I thought I saw movement near the entrance, a shadow too tall and thin to be a person. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of my home. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard faint creaks and raspy breaths coming from the shadows of my room. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the rest stop online, wondering if anyone else had experienced something strange there. What I found left me cold. Several reviews mentioned the restroom, specifically the third stall. People claimed they'd heard whispers, seen doors moving on their own, and felt an overwhelming sense of dread whenever they got too close. One review simply read, "Don't look inside the third stall. Ever." I never went back to that rest stop, and I've avoided public restrooms ever since. But sometimes late at night, I'll hear the faint creak of a door or a soft, raspy breath. And I'll wonder if whatever was in that stall is still waiting for someone brave enough to open the door completely. When I got the job as a night janitor at an old office building downtown, I thought it would be easy money. The work was simple: clean the floors, empty the trash, lock up, and leave before sunrise. The building was nearly empty at night, with most employees long gone by the time my shift began. It was quiet, even peaceful in its own way. On my first night, the supervisor handed me a ring of keys. There were dozens of them, each labeled with a faded tag. "These will get you anywhere in the building," he said before leaving me to my shift. I didn't think much of it at the time. The The first few hours passed uneventfully. I mopped the floors, wiped down desks, and checked the restrooms. The building was an old, 7-story structure, its narrow hallways lined with outdated wallpaper and buzzing fluorescent lights. The hum of the lights and the occasional groan of the air ducts were the only sounds. Around 2 a.m. I decided to explore. I had seen most of the floors during my rounds, but one area intrigued me: the basement. The elevator panel had a button for it, but the supervisor hadn't mentioned it during my orientation. My curiosity got the better of me and I pressed the button. The elevator groaned as it descended, the air growing colder with each floor. When the doors opened, I found myself in a dimly lit corridor. The walls were bare concrete, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. At the far end of the hallway was a heavy steel door. I approached the door cautiously, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the confined space. The tags on the keys jingled softly as I flipped through them, searching for the one labeled basement access. When I found it, the metal was cold against my fingers. The key turned smoothly and the door creaked open. Beyond it was a large, empty room. The walls were lined with old filing cabinets, their drawers slightly ajar, spilling yellowed papers onto the floor. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the space. At first, it looked like nothing more than a forgotten storage area. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something odd. There was another door on the opposite wall. This one was unmarked, its surface scratched and dented as though someone, or something, had tried to force it open. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back. But the keys jingled in my hand and I found myself searching for one that might fit. To my surprise, there was a key with no label, its surface worn smooth from years of use. I slid it into the lock and the door clicked open. The room beyond was pitch black. The light from the storage area barely penetrated the darkness, revealing only the outline of a narrow staircase descending into the ground. The air was colder here, heavier, and carried a faint metallic tang. I stepped back, unsure of whether I wanted to continue. As I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint sound like footsteps coming from somewhere below. I froze, my heart pounding. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and growing louder. They echoed up the stairwell, accompanied by a soft, rhythmic tapping, as though someone were dragging something metal along the walls. I backed away, my hands trembling as I tried to shut the door. But the hinges groaned loudly, the sound reverberating through the basement. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks on me in the eerie stillness. But then the footsteps started again, faster this time, rushing toward the base of the stairs. I slammed the door shut and fumbled with the key, locking it as quickly as I could. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I stumbled back into the storage room. The door shook violently as though something was throwing itself against it. The metal hinges creaked and I feared they might give way. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I didn't wait to find out what was on the other side. I locked the steel door leading to the basement hallway and ran back to the elevator, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the button. When the doors finally closed, I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. I didn't go back to the basement for the rest of my shift. When morning came, I left the building without saying a word to the supervisor. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the unmarked door and the sounds from below. I told myself I wouldn't return, that I'd quit and find another job. But curiosity gnawed at me. I wanted to know what was down there, what I had almost seen. The next night, I found myself back at work, the ring of keys heavier in my pocket than it had been before. It started the morning after I moved into my new apartment. The place was small but cozy, with just enough room for me and my few belongings. The bathroom, though slightly outdated, had a large mirror mounted above the sink. It was old, with faint scratches and edges tarnished by time, but it added a certain charm to the space. That first morning, as I stepped into the bathroom to brush my teeth, I noticed something odd. there were faint handprints on the mirror. They were small, as though left by a child, and pressed flat against the glass. I frowned, thinking I must have touched the mirror while unpacking. Grabbing a cloth, I wiped the handprints away and thought nothing more of it. The next morning they were back. This time there were more of them, scattered across the surface as if tiny hands had been pressing against the glass in different directions. The prints were too small to be mine, and I hadn't had any visitors. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was just residue from the previous tenant and cleaned the mirror again. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of those handprints. My apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. The mirror lingered in my mind, an irrational sense of unease growing with each passing hour. By the third morning, the handprints had multiplied. They covered the entire mirror now, overlapping and smeared, as though dozens of small hands had frantically pressed against the glass during the night. My reflection looked distorted, fractured by the chaos of the prints. I tried scrubbing the mirror with every cleaner I could find, but the prints wouldn't budge. They seemed to seep into the glass itself, becoming part of it. As I wiped furiously, I noticed something even more unsettling. The prints weren't on the surface of the mirror. They were on the other side. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The realization hit me like a wave, and I stumbled back, staring at the glass. My distorted reflection stared back at me, but now it felt different, like it wasn't just a reflection anymore. That night, I avoided the bathroom. I brushed my teeth in the kitchen sink, refusing to even glance at the doorway to the bathroom. The apartment felt colder, the air heavier. I kept the lights on, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from the bathroom, faint at first but growing louder. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, steady, like fingers drumming against the glass. My stomach churned as I sat frozen on the couch, listening. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I told myself not to look, but my legs carried me toward the bathroom anyway. The hallway felt impossibly long, the shadows stretching further with each step. When I reached the doorway, I stopped. The bathroom was dark, the mirror barely visible in the faint light spilling in from the hallway. But as I stared, I saw movement. The handprints on the mirror were shifting, sliding slowly across the surface. They twisted and turned, overlapping and rearranging themselves, as though the hands behind the glass were searching for something, or someone. Then, in the center of the mirror, a new handprint appeared. Larger this time, adult-sized, and it was pressed flat against the inside of the glass. I stumbled back, my chest tightening as cold fear spread through me. My reflection remained in the mirror, but it didn't move with me. It stayed still, watching, its head tilting ever so slightly as if studying me. I ran out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me. For the rest of the night, I sat on the couch, clutching my phone, too afraid to move. The next day, I contacted the landlord and demanded someone come to remove the mirror. He seemed confused, insisting that no one else had ever reported anything strange about it. But when the maintenance worker came to take it down, he hesitated. "It's heavy," he said, running his fingers along the edges. "Feels like it's built into the wall." I insisted, and eventually they removed it. Behind the mirror was something that made my stomach drop. A series of faint, child-sized handprints etched into the wall itself, as though they had been pressed there over years, maybe decades. I moved out that same week. Now, in my new apartment, I avoid mirrors whenever I can. But sometimes, late at night, I catch my reflection out of the corner of my eye. And I swear, for just a moment, it's not looking back at me. Moving into a new apartment always comes with its quirks: creaky floors, a faucet that won't stop dripping, or an oddly placed light switch. For me, it was the bedroom closet door. From the moment I moved in, I noticed it wouldn't stay closed. The door wasn't broken. It had a latch, and when I pressed it shut, it clicked securely into place. But somehow, whenever I returned to the bedroom, the door would be slightly ajar, as though someone had nudged it open. At first I assumed it was a draft. The building was old and the windows didn't seal properly, so it made sense that a gust of wind might be responsible. I stuffed a rolled-up towel under the bedroom door to block any airflow and didn't think much of it. But the door kept opening. Every time I entered the room it was the same, just an inch or two ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness inside the closet. It didn't matter how carefully I closed it. Sometimes I'd even stay in the room for a few minutes after shutting it, waiting to see if it would move. It never did while I was watching. It only opened when I wasn't looking. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I decided to test it. I closed the door firmly, making sure the latch clicked into place. Then I placed a chair in front of it, wedging it tightly against the handle. If it opened again, I'd know it wasn't just the wind. Satisfied, I turned off the lights and went to bed. At some point in the night, I woke up. The room was dark, but something felt off. The air was colder than usual, and I had the distinct sense that I wasn't alone. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, the faint glow of the screen illuminating the room. The closet door was open. Not slightly ajar this time, fully open. The chair I had placed in front of it was pushed aside, lying on its side a few feet away. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into the yawning blackness of the closet. It was too dark inside, darker than it should have been. The faint light from my phone didn't seem to penetrate the shadows. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I must have forgotten to secure the chair properly. Still, I couldn't bring myself to get up and close the door. I pulled the covers up to my chin and lay there wide-eyed until morning. The next day, I bought a heavy-duty lock. If the latch wasn't enough to keep the door shut, this would do the trick. I installed it carefully, drilling into the old wood with shaky hands. By the time I was done, the closet door was sealed tight. I tested it several times, pulling and tugging, but the door didn't budge. For the first time since moving in, I felt a sense of relief. That night, I slept soundly, the closet door locked and silent. It stayed that way for a few days. The door remained closed, and I started to convince myself that I'd solved the problem. But the unease never entirely went away. I found myself avoiding the bedroom whenever I could, lingering in the living room or kitchen until I was too tired to stay awake. One evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, I heard it. A soft click. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down my spine. It came from the bedroom, from the closet. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but the longer I sat there, the more certain I became. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and crept toward the bedroom, my heart pounding with every step. The door was open again. The lock was still in place, but the door had swung outward, the black void of the closet waiting beyond. The air was colder near the doorway, and as I shone the flashlight inside, I saw them. Handprints. They were faint but unmistakable, pressed into the dusty wooden floor of the closet. They were large, too large to be mine, and they led from the back of the closet to the door as if something had crawled out. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no way someone could have been inside. I had moved everything into that closet myself when I first moved in. It was empty, or at least it had been. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, clutching the flashlight like it could protect me from whatever was in that closet. When dawn finally came, I called the landlord and demanded an explanation. He seemed surprised, even a little nervous. "No one's lived in that unit for years," he said. "The last tenant? Well, let's just say they left in a hurry." When I pressed him for details, he told me about the man who had lived there before me. He had been a recluse, rarely seen by neighbors, and had moved out abruptly one night, leaving most of his belongings behind. The landlord had found the closet door wide open when he went to clean the apartment, and no amount of repairs had ever fixed it. "Some things just don't stay shut," he said cryptically before hanging up. I moved out the next day, leaving the closet locked and the key behind. But even now in my new place, I can't sleep with closet doors open. Sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I check them, just to be sure. Because no matter how tightly you shut them, some doors are meant to open. I moved into the apartment on a quiet afternoon. It was a small, simple place. Just a living room, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a single hallway that led to a door at the very end. The landlord told me it used to be a utility closet but had been sealed shut years ago. Nothing to worry about, he'd said with a smile. I didn't think twice about it. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, getting used to the creaks of the old floorboards and the distant hum of the building's plumbing. The door at the end of the hall didn't bother me. It was just a door. Until it wasn't. One night as I lay in bed, I heard it, a faint sound coming from the direction of the hallway. At first, I thought it was the neighbors, maybe a television left on too loud or muffled voices through the walls. But the noise wasn't coming from another apartment. It was coming from the door at the end of my hallway. It was soft at first, like a shuffle or a faint scrape. I told myself it was probably just the building settling, an old pipe groaning in the walls. But then the noise grew louder, more distinct, a faint, rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming against wood. I got up, my chest tight with unease, and crept into the hallway. The tapping stopped as I approached the door. The hallway was dark, the overhead light flickering faintly, casting shifting shadows across the walls. I stared at the door for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the noise to start again. It didn't. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to bed. The next morning I checked the door. It was locked tight, just as the landlord had said, the old paint around the edges chipped and cracked. I ran my fingers along the surface, feeling the rough texture of the wood. There was no reason for it to make noise, no gaps, no drafts, nothing out of place. But that night it happened again. The tapping started shortly after midnight, soft and deliberate. This time I didn't get up. I stayed in bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, trying to block out the sound. It didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was behind the door knew I was ignoring it. By the third night, the tapping had turned into knocking. It wasn't frantic or hurried. It was slow, deliberate, and unnervingly steady. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Grabbing my phone, I crept toward the hallway, my hand trembling as I turned on the flashlight. The door was open. Not fully, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. The hallway was colder now, the air heavy and still. My breath hitched as I stared at the door, waiting for something to emerge. Nothing happened. I forced myself to step closer, my pulse pounding in my ears. I reached out and pushed the door shut, the hinges groaning softly in protest. As I backed away, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were scratches on the inside of the door. They were faint but unmistakable, long grooves etched into the wood as though made by fingernails. My stomach churned as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they had always been there, a remnant from when the door had been used as a closet. But deep down I knew better. The next morning I called the landlord. He sounded surprised when I mentioned the noises. "That door hasn't been opened in years," he said. "Are you sure you didn't imagine it?" I told him about the scratches, about the knocking, but he brushed it off. "Old buildings make noise," he said. "It's nothing to worry about." That night I decided to stay awake. I sat in the living room, every light in the apartment blazing, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. Midnight came and went, the silence in the apartment pressing down on me like a weight. And then I heard it. Not tapping. Not knocking. A voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, muffled and garbled, but undeniably coming from behind the door. My skin prickled as I strained to make out the words, but they were too distorted, too warped to understand. It wasn't a single voice either. It was many, overlapping and weaving together, creating a cacophony of sound that made my chest tighten with fear. The door rattled, its hinges creaking under some unseen pressure. I stood frozen, unable to move as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The air grew colder, a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into my skin. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The door was closed again. The hallway was silent. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I packed a bag and left the apartment, leaving the door locked behind me. I called the landlord and told him I was moving out. He didn't argue, just sighed and said, "You're not the first." To this day, I can't explain what happened in that apartment. I try not to think about it, but sometimes late at night I hear faint tapping, soft, deliberate, and impossibly far away. And I wonder if I left that door fully shut. It was just another late shift at the diner. By the time I finished closing up, it was past midnight, and the parking lot outside was eerily empty. My car was parked at the far end under a dim, flickering streetlight. The other employees had already left, and the only sound was the faint hum of the neon diner sign buzzing in the cool night air. I locked the diner door and walked toward my car, the gravel crunching under my boots. Halfway across the lot, I noticed something strange. Headlights, faint but unmistakable, flickering to life at the far edge of the lot. There was no car there before. I stopped in my tracks, squinting into the darkness. The headlights didn't move, just stayed there, two pinpricks of light barely cutting through the night. The car itself was invisible, swallowed by shadows beyond the reach of the streetlights. Telling myself it was probably just someone waiting for a friend or checking their phone, I shook off the unease and kept walking. But as I got closer to my car, the headlights flickered off, plunging the far end of the lot into complete darkness. My breath hitched. I glanced back over my shoulder, but the lights didn't come back on. The rest of the lot was empty, silent, as if daring me to step closer. I hurried to my car, fumbling with my keys as I reached the driver's side door. My hands were shaking slightly, but I managed to unlock the door and slide inside. I locked the doors immediately, exhaling in relief as I gripped the steering wheel. That's when I saw them. In the rearview mirror, the headlights had returned. They were closer now, no more than 10 feet behind my car, glaring bright and steady. My chest tightened as I turned around to look through the back window, expecting to see the car they belonged to. There was nothing there. No car. No engine sound. Just the blinding glow of the headlights, floating impossibly in the darkness. I stared, frozen in disbelief. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe I was overtired, imagining things after a long shift. But the longer I stared, the more real they seemed, two bright orbs of light burning into the back of my car. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I fumbled to unlock it. The screen lit up, and in its glow, I noticed something else. On the back seat, barely visible in the faint light, was the shape of a handprint. It was pressed into the foggy interior of the window, the fingers long and splayed, as if someone had been leaning against the glass from the outside. But I hadn't seen anyone. A wave of cold fear washed over me. My hands shook as I started the engine, the roar of it breaking the oppressive silence. The headlights behind me didn't budge. They didn't blink or waver, just stayed there, impossibly close. I threw the car into reverse, but the second I moved, the headlights blinked out again. The parking lot was plunged into darkness, the streetlights overhead casting only a faint, flickering glow. I slammed the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest, and glanced around. Nothing. The lot was completely empty. For a moment, I sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to calm my breathing. I told myself to just leave, to get out of there and go home, but my eyes drifted back to the rearview mirror, dreading what I might see. The headlights were back. This time they were much closer. They didn't flicker or blink. They didn't move. They were right at the edge of my bumper, so bright that the entire back of the car was bathed in an unnatural glow. The air inside the car grew heavy, and I felt a pressure building in my chest, like something was watching me, waiting for me to react. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. Slamming the car into drive, I sped out of the lot, my tires squealing against the asphalt. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The streets were empty as I drove, my headlights cutting through the dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every shadow seemed to shift, every distant light a pair of eyes watching me. When I finally reached my apartment, I parked close to the building and sprinted inside, locking the door behind me. I stood in the living room staring out the window at the street below. Nothing moved. The lot was empty. For a moment I thought it was over. I tried to convince myself it had all been in my head, the result of too little sleep and too much caffeine. But then, just as I turned away from the window, I saw them again. The headlights. They were parked across the street now, glowing faintly in the shadows, waiting. The idea of spending a weekend camping in the woods seemed perfect at the time. My friends and I had been planning it for months. A break from work, the stress of the city, and the endless notifications on our phones. There would be no Wi-Fi, no distractions, just the four of us, surrounded by nature. The campsite was isolated, deep in the heart of the national forest. It was exactly what we wanted, until everything went wrong. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the dense forest. It was beautiful but unsettling. The trees stood tall and close together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The air was cool, with a slight breeze rustling the leaves. It seemed perfect, at least at first. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and started a campfire as the sun dipped below the horizon. It wasn't long before we were laughing, telling stories, and roasting marshmallows over the crackling flames. For a while, it felt like everything was exactly as it should be. But as the night deepened, the atmosphere began to change. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming in the daylight, now felt ominous and oppressive. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the trees, and every rustle in the underbrush sent a shiver down my spine. We were miles away from the nearest town, completely cut off from the outside world. Around midnight, we started to hear strange noises. At first, it was just the usual sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, leaves rustling. But then there was something else. A low, rhythmic sound, almost like footsteps, coming from the darkness beyond the reach of our firelight. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Probably just an animal," Jake said, trying to sound confident. But I could see the tension in his eyes. We all heard it, but no one wanted to acknowledge what it really sounded like. Someone walking, slowly, deliberately, just beyond our sight. The footsteps stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the campsite. We all exchanged nervous glances, but we tried to laugh it off, blaming it on our overactive imaginations. We were out in the wilderness after all. Animals roam around at night, right? But the unease lingered, and it only got worse. As the fire died down, we decided to turn in for the night. We all climbed into our tents, zipping them up tightly, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that something was watching us. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and creak. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to calm my racing heart. That's when I heard it again. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer. This time they were much closer than before, right outside our tents. I held my breath, my body stiff with fear. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, the sound of someone, or something, circling the campsite. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night. It was Emma. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, unzipping my tent frantically. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow over the campsite. I could see Emma standing by her tent, her flashlight flickering erratically. "Emma, what's wrong?" I shouted, but she was too terrified to answer. She just pointed toward the edge of the woods. I turned to look, my heart pounding. There, just beyond the light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, its eyes reflecting the faint light like a predator's. It was standing perfectly still, just watching us. The air around it seemed to shimmer like a heat wave, distorting its shape. Jake and David came running out of their tents, and we all stood there, frozen, staring at the figure. It didn't move. It just stood there, its eyes locked on us. The silence was suffocating. "Let's get out of here," David whispered urgently. We grabbed our flashlights and started backing away toward the trail that led back to our car, but the figure moved. It didn't walk or run. It glided silently over the ground, closing the distance between us in an unnaturally smooth motion. I could feel my heart racing, my breath coming in short gasps as we turned and sprinted into the darkness. The forest was a maze of shadows, our flashlights barely cutting through the thick underbrush. I could hear the others running behind me, their breaths ragged, but the footsteps were still there, right behind us, keeping pace. It was as if the forest itself was alive, the trees reaching out with gnarled branches trying to trap us. I glanced back for a split second and saw it again, closer this time. The figure's eyes were glowing now, a sickly yellow light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. It was gaining on us. "Keep running," Jake shouted, but his voice was tinged with panic. Suddenly, Emma tripped and fell. I stopped to help her up, but when I turned, the figure was gone. The footsteps had stopped. The forest was deathly silent again, except for the sound of our ragged breathing. We didn't wait to see if it would come back. We pulled Emma to her feet, and with adrenaline pumping through our veins, we ran as fast as we could. The path seemed endless, twisting and turning through the trees, but finally, we saw the faint glow of our car's headlights. We piled into the car, slamming the doors shut, but as we fumbled to start the engine, we saw it. The figure was standing at the edge of the forest, its eyes glowing in the darkness, watching us leave. It made no move to follow, but I could feel its gaze burning into me as we sped away. The drive back to town was a blur. None of us spoke a word until we were safely back in the city. When we finally stopped, we tried to make sense of what had happened, but none of it made any sense. The figure, the footsteps, the way it moved, nothing was natural about it. We told ourselves it was just our imaginations, that the woods had played tricks on our minds. But deep down we all knew the truth. Something had been watching us in those woods. And whatever it was, it had let us go, this time. I had been traveling for hours, exhausted from a long business trip. The highway stretched on endlessly, and by the time I reached the small town, it was well past midnight. The only place that seemed open was a shabby-looking hotel off the main road, its flickering neon sign promising vacancies. At that point, I was too tired to be picky. The lobby was dimly lit and smelled of old carpets and stale air. The receptionist, an elderly woman with deep-set eyes, barely looked up as I entered. She handed me a key with the number 213 stamped on it. As she did, her eyes seemed to flicker with a hint of hesitation. "Are you sure you want that room?" she asked softly, almost as if hoping I'd change my mind. But I was too exhausted to care. I nodded, took the key, and headed up the creaky stairs. The hallway on the second floor was long, poorly lit, and filled with shadows that danced as I walked past. The air was thick, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I blamed it on my tired mind playing tricks. When I reached room 213, I found the door slightly ajar. I paused for a moment, debating whether I should complain, but I figured it was just a careless housekeeping error. I pushed the door open, and the room was as bleak as I expected. Faded wallpaper, a single lamp that barely lit the space, and a musty smell that reminded me of old books left out in the rain. I locked the door behind me, threw my bag on the bed, and went to wash up. But as soon as I entered the bathroom, I noticed something strange. The mirror was cracked, with dark stains around the edges, almost like dried blood. The sight sent a chill down my spine, but I convinced myself it was just grime and wear. Trying to shake off the unease, I splashed water on my face and returned to the bedroom. That's when I noticed it. The room was colder than before. Much colder. I checked the windows, they were shut tight. A chill hung in the air that made my breath visible. I turned up the heater, but nothing happened. I shrugged it off, blaming the drafty old building, and climbed into bed, pulling the thin blankets up to my chin. The exhaustion was taking over, and I just wanted to sleep. But as I lay there, the silence was interrupted by a faint sound. At first, it was barely audible, like a whisper or the rustle of fabric. Then it grew louder, more distinct, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from behind the wall. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the pipes or maybe a rat. But the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, like someone was knocking from the other side. Annoyed and too tired to care, I pounded my fist against the wall. "Quiet down," I shouted. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, to my horror, I heard a faint voice from the other side of the wall. It was a soft, desperate whisper. "Help me." I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. The voice was so clear, so close, as if someone was right next to me. I pressed my ear to the wall, but all I could hear was silence. Trying to convince myself I was just imagining things, I lay back down, pulling the covers tightly around me. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. But this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a loud, anguished scream that seemed to echo through the entire room. I bolted upright, my pulse pounding in my ears. The scream stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I decided I had had enough. I threw on my shoes, grabbed my bag, and headed for the door. But when I tried to turn the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, and the key was missing from where I had left it on the nightstand. Panic set in. I yanked on the handle, pounded on the door, but it was like it was sealed shut. As I struggled, the lights in the room began to flicker. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath fogging up in the air. And then I saw it, a shadow moving in the corner of the room. At first, it was just a flicker, like the light playing tricks. But then it began to take shape. A tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes that seemed to burn into mine. It moved closer, its limbs jerking unnaturally, as if it were being controlled by invisible strings. I backed up against the wall, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The figure stopped just inches away from me, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. Its whisper was now clear, chilling me to my core. "It shouldn't have stayed." I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it was all a nightmare. But when I opened them again, the figure was gone. The door behind me creaked open slowly, as if inviting me to leave. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag and bolted down the hallway, not stopping until I was outside in the cold night air. When I reached the lobby, the receptionist was gone. The hotel was completely silent, as if it had been abandoned for years. The only sound was my ragged breathing. I ran to my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I sped away from the hotel, I tried to make sense of what had happened. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, my blood turned to ice. There, in the back seat, was the same gaunt figure, its hollow eyes staring at me. I swerved off the road, my car coming to a screeching halt. I turned around, but the back seat was empty. My mind was reeling. Was it real, or was I losing my sanity? I drove through the night without stopping, not daring to look back. The next day, I called the hotel, hoping to get some explanation. But the number was disconnected, and when I searched for its address, I found nothing. It was as if the hotel had never existed. But I can still hear that whisper in my dreams. It shouldn't have stayed. It all started with a simple dare. My friends and I had been hanging out at Ben's place one chilly autumn evening, the air filled with the scent of fallen leaves and the sound of distant wind chimes. We were bored, looking for something to do, when someone brought up the old playground on the outskirts of town, a place everyone said was haunted. The playground had been abandoned for years. Local legends claimed that it was once a popular place for families, but a tragic accident had turned it into a place no one dared visit. According to the stories, a child had gone missing there one night, and ever since, strange things had been happening. Lights flickering, swings moving on their own, eerie laughter echoing in the dark. It was all just urban legend, or so we thought. "Let's check it out," Ben suggested with a mischievous grin. "Unless you're too scared." I rolled my eyes. We were all too old for ghost stories, but the idea of exploring the old playground on a dark night was too tempting to pass up. We grabbed our flashlights, bundled up in jackets, and set off into the cold night air. The walk to the playground took about 20 minutes, but as we approached, the atmosphere began to change. The trees became thicker, their branches like gnarled fingers reaching out to block the moonlight. The temperature seemed to drop, and the silence was so heavy that even our footsteps sounded unnaturally loud. The playground loomed ahead of us, a sad and forgotten place. Rusted swings creaked in the wind, and the old merry-go-round stood still like a sentinel in the darkness. The entire area was covered in overgrown weeds, and graffiti covered the walls of what used to be a restroom. As we stepped closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "All right, let's split up," Ben said, trying to sound brave. "We'll cover more ground that way." Reluctantly, we agreed. I ended up with Emma, while Ben and David went in the opposite direction. Emma and I approached the old swing set, where one swing swayed slowly as if someone had just been sitting on it. "Must be the wind," Emma muttered, but her voice was shaky. As we moved deeper into the playground, the air grew even colder. We heard what sounded like faint laughter in the distance, but whenever we shined our flashlights toward the sound, there was nothing there. Just darkness and more broken playground equipment. Then we heard Ben scream. Emma and I sprinted toward the sound, our hearts pounding. We found Ben near the old slide, his face pale and his hands shaking. "I saw something," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "A kid." I frowned. "A kid? Out here? Are you sure?" Ben nodded frantically. He was standing at the top of the slide, just staring at me. But when I looked again, he was gone. David arrived a few moments later, and we decided to stick together. The playground had lost its thrill, now it was just terrifying. The wind picked up, and the rusted chains of the swings clinked together, creating an eerie symphony. "Let's just get out of here," I said. But as we turned to leave, the laughter returned, louder this time. It wasn't joyful laughter, it was distorted, like a recording being played too slowly. The sound seemed to come from all directions, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Suddenly, the lights in the playground flickered to life. The bulbs above the swings and slide, which should have been dead for years, began to glow with a sickly yellow light. The merry-go-round started to spin slowly on its own, creaking as it turned. We stood frozen, trying to understand what was happening. That's when we saw them, figures moving at the edges of the playground. At first, they looked like children, small silhouettes darting between the equipment. But as they moved closer, we realized there was something horribly wrong. Their eyes glowed a faint red, and their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. One of them, what looked like a little girl, stood just a few feet away, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. She opened her mouth, but instead of a scream, a low, guttural growl came out. "Run!" David shouted, breaking the trance that held us all. We sprinted toward the exit, but no matter how fast we ran, the playground seemed to stretch on endlessly as if it was trying to trap us. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, and the lights flickered erratically. I could feel something cold brushing against my arm, like fingers trying to grab me. I turned, swinging my flashlight wildly, but there was nothing there. Emma was screaming, her eyes wide with terror, but I couldn't see what was chasing her. We finally burst through the gates of the playground, panting and gasping for breath. But as we looked back, the lights abruptly went out, plunging the entire area into darkness. The laughter stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy it was suffocating. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road. None of us spoke on the way back to Ben's house. Once we were safely inside, we tried to make sense of what had happened, but there was no explanation. Ben was convinced we had seen ghosts, while David suggested it was some kind of elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew that what we had encountered was something far worse. The next day I did some research online. I found an old newspaper article about the playground, about the child who had gone missing years ago. The search party had found nothing but his shoes near the merry-go-round. The article mentioned that ever since then, people reported hearing strange laughter and seeing ghostly figures at night. That night, as I tried to sleep, I kept hearing the sound of laughter outside my window. When I finally gathered the courage to look, there was nothing there. But the next morning, I found small footprints in the dirt outside my house, leading up to my bedroom window. I haven't gone near that playground since, but I can still hear the laughter in my dreams. I had never liked doing laundry late at night, but my work schedule didn't leave me much choice. The building I lived in was old, with a shared laundry room in the basement that was only accessible by a creaky, outdated elevator. Residents rarely used it after dark, and for good reason. It was a dreary, dimly lit space that always seemed colder than the rest of the building. But that night I had no choice. My clothes had piled up for weeks, and I was down to my last clean shirt. It was almost midnight when I finally grabbed my laundry basket and headed for the basement. The elevator groaned in protest as it descended, the old cables creaking ominously. As the doors opened, I was greeted by the familiar smell of detergent and mildew. The fluorescent lights flickered as I stepped out, casting unsettling shadows that danced across the cracked concrete walls. The laundry room itself was tucked away at the far end of a long, narrow corridor. I could hear the hum of the old machines even before I reached the door, their rhythmic drone oddly comforting in the otherwise silent basement. But as I pushed open the door, that comfort quickly vanished. The room was completely empty as expected. But there was something different, something that made my skin crawl. The air was colder than usual, with an odd dampness that clung to my skin. I tried to ignore the feeling as I loaded my clothes into one of the machines and started it up. As I waited, I scrolled through my phone to pass the time, but there was no signal this deep underground. I tried to distract myself with a game, but after a few minutes I began to notice something strange. The rhythmic hum of the washing machine started to slow, as if struggling against some unseen force. The fluorescent lights flickered again, and the room plunged into darkness for a moment before the lights sputtered back on. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the washer's glass door, I caught a glimpse of movement behind me. My heart skipped a beat and I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty room and the steady hum of the machines. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. The feeling of unease didn't go away though. As the minutes passed, the air in the room grew heavier, almost suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The washing machine finished its cycle with a loud, jarring clunk, breaking the tense silence. I quickly transferred my clothes to the dryer, eager to get out of there as fast as possible. As the dryer rumbled to life, the flickering lights dimmed once more, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the room. I tried to focus on my phone again, but this time it died completely, the screen going black. I cursed under my breath. Maybe it was just the battery, or maybe something about this basement interfered with electronics. That's when the scratching started. At first it was faint, like nails dragging lightly across concrete. I paused, straining my ears, but the noise stopped. I turned back to the dryer, willing the minutes to pass faster. But the scratching came again, louder now, and this time it was coming from behind the row of machines. I took a step forward, my breath shallow, trying to peer into the narrow gap between the dryers and the wall. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible whisper that sent chills down my spine. It was like 100 voices murmuring all at once, too quiet to understand but loud enough to fill the room with an oppressive presence. I backed away, my heart pounding, but just as I turned toward the door, the lights went out completely. The darkness was absolute, swallowing every corner of the room. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, hoping the flashlight would work despite its dead battery. But it was useless, the screen remained black. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of hissing sounds. Then, out of the darkness, I heard a new noise, a low, guttural breathing, as if something was standing just inches away from me. I froze, terrified to move, my eyes straining to see something, anything in the pitch black. Suddenly, I felt it, a cold, clammy hand brushing against my shoulder. I screamed, stumbling backward into one of the machines. The lights flickered back on, and the room was empty again, the machines quietly humming as if nothing had happened. But I could still feel the coldness on my shoulder, a lingering touch that sent waves of nausea through me. I grabbed my half-dry clothes, stuffing them haphazardly into my basket, desperate to get out. As I rushed toward the door, the lights began to flicker wildly, and the whispers returned, more frantic this time. I slammed into the elevator button repeatedly, praying it would arrive before whatever was in the basement decided to show itself again. The elevator finally creaked open, and I jumped inside, hitting the button for my floor. As the doors slowly slid shut, I looked back one last time. Standing at the far end of the laundry room was a shadowy figure, tall and hunched, its face obscured by darkness. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. The doors closed with a shudder, and the elevator groaned as it ascended. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispers, feel the cold touch on my shoulder. The next day, I tried to report what had happened, but the building manager just shrugged it off as my imagination. "That old basement is creepy," he said with a chuckle. "It plays tricks on people." I've since moved out of that building, but sometimes, even in my new apartment, I wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of faint scratching. And whenever I have to do laundry, I avoid the basement at all costs. But the thing that haunts me most is what I found in the pocket of my jeans the next day, a small, rusted key that I had never seen before. I have no idea what it unlocks, and I'm too afraid to find out. Taking the night shift at the grocery store seemed like a good idea at first. The pay was decent, and I figured it would be quiet enough for me to get some studying done during the lulls. The store itself was part of a chain, located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dark, empty parking lots. I had worked a few night shifts before, and nothing strange had ever happened, until that night. It was a Friday evening, and I arrived for my shift at 10 p.m. The store was mostly empty except for the occasional late-night shopper. As the clock struck midnight, the last customer left, and I locked the entrance doors. That's when the silence set in. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, and the steady hum of the refrigerated aisles filled the air. It felt like the entire world had gone to sleep, leaving me alone in a bubble of artificial light. The first hour passed uneventfully. I busied myself restocking shelves, the sound of cans and packages hitting the metal racks echoing through the aisles. But as I was finishing up in the cereal section, I heard it, the sound of a shopping cart rolling across the tiled floor. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the hum of the store's machinery. I looked up, expecting to see a stray cart moving due to a draft or a slight incline. But the aisles were empty. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the silence. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks. But as I continued to work, strange things began to happen. The lights in aisle 12 started flickering intermittently, plunging that section into darkness before blinking back to life. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard a faint rustling sound like someone rifling through the snack aisle. The store was supposed to be locked. There shouldn't have been anyone else here. My heart rate quickened. I grabbed a flashlight from the back office and decided to check it out. As I made my way toward aisle 12, the air seemed to grow colder, and the fluorescent lights dimmed further. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of chips and soda bottles, but no sign of anyone. I was about to turn back when I noticed something odd. The shelves on one side of the aisle were wet, as if someone had spilled water all over the floor. But as I shone the light closer, I realized it wasn't water. It was a dark, thick liquid that glistened under the light. It looked like oil or blood. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady. That's when I heard the whispering. It was faint, almost like a breeze, but there were no vents nearby. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the shelves, filling the space around me. It was as if multiple voices were speaking at once, too low to understand but filled with urgency. I turned and sprinted back toward the front of the store, my footsteps echoing in the empty aisles. As I reached the checkout area, the lights began to flicker wildly, casting strange shadows that seemed to twist and move. I hurried behind the counter to check the security cameras, hoping to find some explanation. The monitors showed the empty aisles just as they should have, but there was something off. In the grainy black and white footage, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing motionless at the end of aisle 12. It wasn't human. The figure was tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, and its face was completely blank, a dark void where eyes and a mouth should have been. I blinked and the figure was gone. Panic set in. I wanted to leave, but the doors were locked and I was the only one with the keys. As I fumbled to unlock them, the store's intercom crackled to life. Static filled the air, followed by faint, distorted laughter. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the store, followed by a voice, low, guttural, and impossible to understand. The power suddenly cut out, plunging the entire store into darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grip the keys. I turned on my flashlight again, its narrow beam my only protection against whatever was lurking in the shadows. As I moved toward the exit, the sound of footsteps echoed behind me, slow and deliberate. It was as if someone, or something, was stalking me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't dare turn around. I could feel its presence, cold and menacing, like an icy breath on the back of my neck. Just as I reached the exit, something slammed into the door from the other side, rattling it in its frame. I screamed, stumbling backward. The flashlight slipped from my grasp and spun across the floor, its beam flickering wildly. In that brief flash of light, I saw it, the shadowy figure from the security footage, now standing just a few feet away from me. Its limbs twisted and contorted as it moved closer, its faceless head tilting to one side as if curious. The whispers returned, louder now, filling my ears like a swarm of angry bees. My vision blurred, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. The temperature in the store dropped even further, my breath visible in the cold air. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed the flashlight and sprinted down a side aisle toward the emergency exit at the back. The whispers turned into screams, filling the store with a deafening roar. The shelves around me shook, cans and bottles crashing to the floor as if something was trying to trap me. I reached the back exit, threw the door open, and stumbled out into the cold night air. The moment I crossed the threshold, the screams stopped, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. The lights in the store flickered back on and everything went still. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, but I managed to start the engine and sped away, not daring to look back. The next morning I quit the job. When I tried to explain what had happened, the manager just stared at me, confused. The security footage from that night was gone, nothing but static on the tapes. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that grocery store. But sometimes late at night, I still hear the faint sound of whispering, like the echoes of a nightmare that refuses to end. It started off as just another rainy Tuesday. I had recently moved into a small apartment in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. The building was older, with creaky floors and thin walls, but the rent was cheap and it was close to my new job. I was still getting used to living alone, trying to enjoy the solitude. My new place was on the 3rd floor with a decent view of the park across the street. The only odd thing was my neighbor, apartment 306. I had never seen anyone come or go from that unit. The door always stayed shut, and there was a thick layer of dust on the welcome mat as if no one had walked on it in years. The mail slot was always overflowing with letters that no one ever collected. Initially, I didn't think much of it. People in big cities kept to themselves and I had no reason to pry. But after a few days I started noticing strange things. Every night, without fail, around 2 a.m., I would hear noises coming from 306, soft, rhythmic thumping sounds that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It was as if someone was pacing back and forth, over and over, never stopping. At first, I dismissed it as the sounds of an old building settling or maybe just my overactive imagination. But the noises continued, growing louder each night. I tried to ignore them, turning up the volume on my TV or putting in earplugs. But even through the muffled noise, I could still feel the vibrations in the walls. One night, after a particularly loud bout of thumping, I decided to investigate. I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, the air thick with the musty smell of old carpet. The sound was louder here, more distinct. It wasn't just random creaking. It was deliberate, like someone methodically banging on the floorboards. I walked over to apartment 306 and pressed my ear to the door. The thumping continued, steady and relentless. I knocked, hoping it was just a neighbor with some strange late-night habit, but there was no answer. The noise just went on, completely unbothered by my presence. I felt a chill crawl up my spine and quickly retreated to my apartment. That night I hardly slept. The sound continued until the early hours of the morning, finally stopping around dawn. The next day I tried asking the building manager about it. He was a grizzled old man who had worked there for decades. When I mentioned apartment 306, his expression darkened. "No one's lived in that unit for years," he said gruffly. "It's been vacant since the last tenant. Well, since the incident." He refused to elaborate further, dismissing my questions with a wave of his hand. I was left with more questions than answers, but I decided it wasn't worth the trouble. I had work to focus on, and whatever was happening in 306 wasn't my problem. But the disturbances only grew worse. Every night, like clockwork, the noises would start, thumping followed by faint scratching sounds as if someone was clawing at the walls. It got so bad that I dreaded going to bed. I would lie there in the darkness, heart racing, listening to the relentless sounds coming from next door. Then one night, everything escalated. I was sitting in my living room trying to drown out the noise with headphones when the lights started flickering. The apartment plunged into darkness for a moment before the power came back on. That's when I heard it, a faint whispering so soft it was almost drowned out by the hum of the fridge. The whispers were coming from the wall I shared with 306. I felt a surge of panic. This wasn't just strange noises anymore. Something was wrong. I grabbed a flashlight and reluctantly walked toward the shared wall. As I approached, the whispers grew louder, almost like a chant. My pulse quickened as I pressed my ear against the wall. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a loud crash from the other side. The impact was so violent that my entire apartment seemed to shake. I jumped back, my heart hammering. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see what was happening in 306. I grabbed my keys and rushed into the hallway, the air feeling colder than it should have been. The door to 306 was slightly ajar, as if someone had just gone inside. But the building manager had said it was vacant. The hallway lights flickered ominously as I approached, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The apartment was pitch black, with only the faint light from the hallway illuminating the entryway. The smell hit me first, a rancid, musty odor that made me gag. I shone my flashlight around, revealing a space that looked untouched for years. Dust covered every surface and cobwebs hung like curtains. But the strangest thing was the floor. There were deep gouges in the wooden boards, like something had been dragged back and forth repeatedly. The thumping started again, this time right beneath my feet, as if something was trying to break through the floor. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight beam flickering. Then I saw it, a dark figure standing at the far end of the room, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching me. A wave of cold fear washed over me. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding, but the figure began to move, its limbs jerking like a broken puppet. The whispers returned, louder now, filling my ears with a frantic, desperate chant. I stumbled, nearly dropping my flashlight, and that's when the figure lunged. I turned and ran, slamming the door behind me, the sound of the thumping now right on the other side. The hallway was filled with shadows that seemed to reach out for me as I sprinted back to my apartment. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling, and backed away, expecting it to burst open at any moment. But everything went silent. The whispers, the thumping, all of it stopped. It was as if nothing had happened. I never went back to that hallway. I never asked the building manager about 306 again. I put in my notice the very next day and moved out before the week was over. But even now, in my new apartment miles away, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of faint thumping, as if something is still trying to reach me through the walls. And sometimes, just before I drift off to sleep, I hear those same whispers, reminding me that whatever I encountered in 306 hasn't forgotten me. The camping trip was supposed to be a simple escape, just 3 friends spending a weekend away from the city noise. The chosen campsite was remote, deep in the forest, accessible only after an hour's hike. It was peaceful, surrounded by tall pines and blanketed by the quiet hum of nature. After reaching the clearing, the group set up 2 tents. One for Matt and Claire, the couple, and the other for me. As dusk fell, a campfire crackled in the center of the site. The warmth and light offered some comfort against the encroaching darkness. By nightfall, the fire had died down to embers, and the forest grew colder and quieter. The 3 of us retreated to our tents. The silence of the woods enveloped me as I crawled into my sleeping bag, lulled by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Sometime in the night, I woke to a sound, a faint rhythmic crunching of pine needles underfoot. It wasn't the random scurry of animals, but deliberate, slow footsteps. They circled my tent once, then paused. I held my breath, listening intently. After what felt like an eternity, the steps moved away toward the other's tent. Morning came, and the forest seemed unnaturally still. Matt and Claire were already outside when I emerged from my tent. Their faces were tense, their conversation hushed. They mentioned hearing something during the night, footsteps outside their tent, paired with a strange, faint muttering. Matt had considered stepping out to investigate but ultimately stayed still. The unsettling atmosphere only deepened when we noticed it, a 3rd tent. It stood at the edge of the clearing, tucked under the shadows of the pines. The fabric was old, faded, and stained with dirt. The rain fly hung unevenly, and the tent's entrance was partially unzipped, revealing a hollow blackness inside. None of us had seen it when we set up camp. As we approached, unease settled over us. It was undeniable that this tent hadn't been there the day before. Claire hesitated, suggesting it could belong to a hiker who might still be nearby, but the site showed no signs of recent activity. No tracks, no gear. Matt peered closer, his hand hovering near the flap, but something held him back. Eventually we returned to our routine, forcing ourselves to ignore the tent. But its presence lingered in our minds, a silent reminder that we were not as alone as we thought. The day passed uneventfully, though the woods felt different, heavier. By evening, the 3rd tent seemed closer, as though it had moved. Its position was subtly shifted toward the center of the clearing. No one mentioned it, but we all noticed. That night, sleep was impossible. The air was too cold, and every sound seemed amplified. At some point, I heard the footsteps again. They were slower this time, circling all 3 tents. My pulse quickened as the steps stopped directly outside the 3rd tent. The sound of the zipper being dragged open pierced the silence. It was agonizingly slow, each metallic tooth clicking as it moved. I froze in my sleeping bag, unable to look or move, my heart pounding in my ears. The zipper stopped. Then came the muttering again, louder this time, though the words were indecipherable. The voice was guttural, layered, as if more than one person was speaking in unison. The sound was wrong, inhuman. I lay there, paralyzed, until the muttering stopped and the footsteps retreated into the forest. Morning brought little relief. The third tent was gone. There was no sign of it, not a footprint, not a dent in the ground where it had stood. The clearing was pristine as if it had never been there. Matt and Claire were visibly shaken but refused to discuss it. We broke camp quickly, eager to leave. As we packed, I noticed something etched into the dirt where the tent had been, a crude symbol, circular and unfamiliar, pressed into the earth like it had been burned there. I didn't mention it, not wanting to linger a moment longer than necessary. We hiked out in silence, the forest closing in behind us. Even now, I can't explain what we encountered. The third tent wasn't just an object. It was a presence, a shadow that moved with intent. I've been camping since, but I never go anywhere too remote. And sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I hear the faint sound of a zipper being drawn open, slow and deliberate. And I wonder if the tent has found someone else. When I moved into the old Victorian house, I was drawn to its charm. The creaking wooden floors, the high ceilings, the intricate crown molding. It had been unoccupied for years, its last tenant moving out suddenly, or so the real estate agent said. The house felt lonely, its rooms filled with silence and dust motes dancing in the filtered sunlight. The only part of the house I avoided was the room at the top of the stairs. It wasn't locked, just an ordinary wooden door at the end of the narrow hallway. But there was something about it that made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the way the air felt colder near it, or how the wood seemed darker than the other doors in the house. Whatever the reason, I didn't go near it. For the first week, I told myself it was just an old house settling. Creaks and groans in the night were to be expected. I ignored the occasional feeling of being watched and the faint tapping sounds I sometimes heard from upstairs. But things began to change. One evening, as I was reading in the living room, I heard it, a soft, deliberate creak from above, like someone shifting their weight on the wooden floor. My chest tightened. The sound came again, followed by another, closer this time, as though someone was walking down the hallway. I stayed frozen in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Gathering my courage, I climbed the stairs, my footsteps slow and hesitant. The hallway was empty, but the door at the end was slightly ajar. It hadn't been opened before. The cold air hit me as I stepped closer. The faint smell of damp wood and something metallic lingered in the air. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Instead, I backed away, retreating downstairs and locking myself in my bedroom for the rest of the night. The next morning, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Old houses have drafts, I reasoned. Doors shift on their hinges. Determined to prove myself right, I forced the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty. It was small, with a single dusty window overlooking the overgrown backyard. The walls were bare except for faint discolorations, as though something heavy had once hung there. The wooden floor was scratched and scuffed, the marks erratic, almost claw-like. I shivered and left quickly, closing the door behind me. But no matter how tightly I pulled it shut, it wouldn't stay closed. Every time I passed the hallway, the door was ajar again, revealing the dim interior of the room. That night, I woke to the sound of something scraping. It was faint, rhythmic, and coming from the room at the top of the stairs. My pulse quickened as I lay there, listening. The scraping grew louder, more deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. Then it stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the noise. And then, faintly, I heard a sound that made my stomach turn. Breathing. Slow, labored, and coming from just outside my bedroom door. I stayed perfectly still, my eyes locked on the sliver of light beneath the door. A shadow moved across it and I felt my breath catch. The shadow lingered for a moment, then slowly retreated. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The following day, I found the courage to inspect the room again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before. The scratches on the floor led to a specific spot, a faint outline of a trapdoor, its edges barely visible against the wooden planks. My stomach churned as I crouched down, prying the edges with my fingers. The trapdoor gave way with a groan, revealing a dark, narrow space beneath the floorboards. The smell of damp earth wafted up, stronger now, almost suffocating. Inside the space, I saw them. Scratches on the underside of the boards, desperate and chaotic, as though someone had been clawing their way out. That night, I tried to leave the house. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and headed for the front door. But the moment I stepped outside, the air grew heavier, colder. The world felt wrong, as though the house had shifted, bending reality around itself. When I turned back, the door to the room at the top of the stairs was wide open. Alright, that's all the stories for today. I'm so glad you stayed with me until the end. It really means a lot. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.